This story began on a dark and rainy night when Adeline, our heroine, faced death. A dark figure with a sword in hand looked at her mercilessly. The heroine tried to look at the man without showing fear, hoping for mercy and another chance. Many thoughts went through Adeline's head, from the smallest to the most incredible. But she knew that nothing and no one would help her. Realizing that her action would be pointless, the girl, to overcome the fear oppressing her, or perhaps she was simply tired of being afraid, dared to attack first. But the killer, as if reading her thoughts, was the first to strike. And a moment later, she felt the sword pierce her body. Adeline, despite the pain in her chest, intently looked at the man's face, trying to find answers to her questions in it. She felt neither fear nor pain. She was just very sad, because she understood that life was ending and that behind her there were only meaningless lived years. The girl was already dying, and she saw herself as if from the outside. And she also heard the desperate cry of her soul to give her one last chance to start everything anew. And suddenly, something incredible happened. When the pain disappeared, and feeling a surge of vitality, the heroine was surprised to see her reflection in the mirror. She saw herself alive. The girl turned around and saw a room with a canopy bed, a chandelier, a small table with a sofa, and it was incredible, as the decor seemed familiar to her. Suddenly, someone grabbed Adeline by the elbow and called her in a painfully familiar voice. The heroine looked back at the voice and looked at the woman with great anticipation, experiencing joy and amazement upon seeing her maid Elda alive and well. Adeline was sure of her death, because she remembered holding the maid in her arms when she breathed her last breath. Memories flashed before the heroine's eyes, in the form of gossip that Count Lothan had cheated on his wife. In her memories, she saw the banquet hall and herself, the girl in the maid's arms, as well as contemptuous glances, showing that no one wanted to see them here. Thus, the girl grew up with the stigma that she was the illegitimate daughter of Count Lothan, as well as an unwanted child of low birth. Adeline emerged from her sad memories and impulsively hugged her beloved maid. The girl hugged Elda, the only person who supported her and was always on her side, and she was alive too and close again. And this was reality. Later, when the first torrent of emotions passed in talking with Elda, our heroine returned to her memories. In her memories, Adeline again felt like a child when she played pranks and Hilda cried, and she thought about how quickly her little one had grown up. Another memory of the heroine was her wedding, where there was neither a majestic groom nor a shy bride, neither affectionate kisses nor tender hugs. This marriage to the Duke, without love or passion, existed only on paper, on a small sheet of paper with a seal. But it was conceived for a specific purpose. The girl sadly remembered that she had done everything possible to leave the hated house, to forget the contemptuous glances, ridicule, and bullying. And here she is again, in this wicked house, in which she was treated as a useless child and unwanted, but she returned to an era when she was not yet married, when she was still Adeline Lawton. Looking at the rising sun, the heroine realized that this was her second chance, that she should not lose, which means she would take advantage of it and live her life as she saw fit. In her own way, hearing the door open, the girl turned to find out who had entered her room so unceremoniously. It was the dear and respected Bianca Lotz, the daughter of the Lowton family, who looked at Adeline evaluatively, surprised that the girl looked very well. Squinting her eyes with contempt, Bianca did not greet, but immediately expressed her disdain for the taste of the Duke, who agreed to marry Adeline. Our heroine, as usual, bowed her head and agreed with her, since Bianca was the pearl of the Lothan house, and she herself was only an illegitimate daughter. But then Adeline noticed the arrogant girl that there was still a man who had chosen her, for which she should be very grateful. Elda, noticing disrespectful notes in her ward's communication, was very scared for her. Adeline looked at Elda and felt ashamed, because she remembered that in a past life, her beloved maid cried for her, and immediately swore to endure everything to change the future. Looking at Bianca, our heroine calmly accepted that there was a man who, despite her status, had chosen her. But then anger erupted in Bianca, and she began to shout that Adeline was marrying a simple and small duke so that Adeline would not think she was jealous of her, since there was nothing to envy. After listening calmly, our heroine noted that they were in different positions, and added with a smile that no one would choose Bianca. Anger and rage burst from Bianca. She shouted and insulted Adeline, thus showing her essence. Before a polite knock on the door and the calm voice of the servant, which interrupted the flow of curses, Bianca looked angrily, wanting to incinerate the newcomer with her gaze. The butler entered the room and, clearing his throat, bowed, and announced that Madame Adelina was expected downstairs. Smiling at the furious Bianca, our heroine walked past her with pride and dignity, wishing her a last happy stay, and went to meet her fiancé. Entering the living room, Adeline wondered why she had been given this opportunity, why she had been given another chance, and why she had returned specifically on her wedding day. Adeline walked, and before her eyes was the image of a man, the image of the owner of the lands of darkness, a place from which no one can leave alive, the image of the most powerful person, and with great strength, Duke Horace Bensark. As if in a dream or with a feeling of déjà vu, the girl fearfully opened the door, thinking about what awaited her after the ceremony. Our heroine saw how the guests made way for her, how they looked at her with interest, with envy, and some even with irony. And Adeline looked at her future husband, and different feelings overwhelmed her. Remembering that she had loved him for 25 years, the girl forgot nothing, but also remembered that she not only loved her husband, but also how she died by his sword. The man waiting for her in this room turned around, and without paying attention to the guests and their reaction, he looked at the girl with interest, clarifying if she really was Adeline Lawton. Adeline stood before the Duke, beautiful and unperturbed, and with a smile looking him in the eyes. She said that she finally met him, the famous Duke Bensark. Expressing her courtesy and sophistication, the girl said that she was actually Adeline Lawton, and that she was very happy to meet him. Smiling sweetly and showing goodwill, the girl extended her hand to the man, asking if he would accompany her, and Duke Bensark looked at her and remembered his dream, which was not just a dream. He dreamed of a prophecy. It was a prophetic, and at the same time exciting dream, which gave the order to find Adeline Lawton and, together with her, conquer the world. The Duke looked into the distance, remembering his dream once more, which he seemed to have seen in reality, and he realized that he must fulfill the prophecy. A few days before meeting our heroine, Duke Horace Bensark, who for his friends was simply king, met his friend Asterlef in his living room. Asterlef was a man who, upon seeing the truth, read the manuscript and expressed his opinion that this dream was similar to the prediction they were looking for. In a conversation with his friend, Aster reflected. He expressed his assumption that the prediction itself was related to the Count's daughter, and suggested waiting and finding out if it was a prophetic dream or not. Ray thought for a long time and thought about Adeline, about her fate, and convinced himself that he had to bring her before strangers noticed. Aster, in his own way, was surprised how scared Adeline became when she heard the Duke's name, and he also expressed his amazement when it became known that permission to marry was given very quickly. Although this was not normal, Aster pointed out in his reasoning that there would be no wedding ceremony, but it would be advisable to at least personally pick up the bride, to which the Duke said he saw no point. But the friend tried to prove to him that it was necessary to support the girl, to show her at least a little sincerity, because she was now in a deplorable state, and these thoughts overwhelmed Ray more and more. Aster assured the Duke that Adeline was a submissive and modest girl, and that there was nothing difficult in showing sensitivity towards her. And so, looking at the girl who stood proudly before him, the Duke remembered Aster's words, and was perplexed. Ray looked at the bride, and in his thoughts wondered if he was asking a stranger if this particular girl was modest and sad. But Adeline, glancing at the familiar features, tried to understand what other person could look into her eyes with such confidence. The Duke turned towards the exit, without extending his hand to his bride, but passing it over his shoulder so that she would follow him. The girl lowered her eyes sadly, thinking about the injustice of fate, about all the trials she had to endure in life. Hearing the receding footsteps, Adeline thought about what a bad person her husband was, because he refused to celebrate the wedding. He didn't even ask for her hand in marriage, and only said a couple of words the whole time. After the wedding ceremony, when they had already become husband and wife, and she was also a duchess, the girl hoped that the Duke would still extend his hand to accompany her and go with her. Our heroine loved her husband for 25 years, but the memories of their first and last encounter were equally cold. Looking down and almost in a whisper, Adeline still asked if the Duke would accompany her to the carriage. Approaching the bride and looking closely at her, Gray remained silent, and only bewilderment was reflected in his gaze. Having set aside all sad thoughts, Adeline turned to the Duke and slightly bowed her head and gave him a radiant look. Bensark stood near the carriage. He was indignant and tried to find out from his friend where he saw modesty and humility in this girl. Astor laughed so hard that tears even sprang from his eyes, and through his laughter he tried to say that when he arrived. She behaved quite modestly, but then Astor's laughter was interrupted, and he said seriously, recalling that today Adeline did not even lift her head, and was very emotional. The noise of hooves and the squeak of carriage wheels approaching was heard, and then it was heard that the Duchess's carriage had arrived. After a short ride, getting out of the carriage, Adeline was surprised, as she expected to see a mansion. But it wasn't there, and the girl looked inquisitively at her husband. Ray did not keep her in ignorance for long, and told her that he would go to the mansion by a different route. Our hero was pondering what would be the best way to choose his words, and decided to ask his wife directly if she had heard anything about magic. Adeline burst out laughing, assuring her husband that she had heard about magic, since in a past life he himself had told her about magic. The heroine immediately said that she often asked Ray everything she didn't know, and that he always answered her questions as sincerely as possible. Ray was not surprised by his wife's answer, but asked if she could use magic. Adeline confirmed that she can use magic, but is extremely unsure. The girl said that it was the Duke who taught her everything, but she was not successful in everything. When he asked her to show him what magic she could use, Adeline refused to do so, citing the fact that she was tired. The Duke looked thoughtfully at his wife and said that, according to conversations, Lothan's youngest daughter was quite modest. But Adeline's image was far from the truth. The girl mockingly suggested that Ray look for someone who behaves as he likes. Astor was surprised to see the Duke and Duchess looking at each other, as if lightning was running between them. Composing himself, the Duke asked Adeline if she had used teleportation before, to which he received a negative answer. Speaking about the new method of movement, Ray warned that sometimes, after the first time, there is a possibility of fainting. The Duke spoke of teleportation as if he wanted to instill fear, but still, he carefully added that the Duchess should be more careful. Adeline was not afraid, but looked extremely excited, as she had to move for the first time using teleportation. The Duke looked closely at his wife, warning once more that the transition would be difficult. Adeline was surprised by her husband's concern, but assured him that she would try very hard. Night, dark trees and bushes, the full moon illuminates the house, in whose windows there was still light. And this was the first thing Ray and Astor saw after moving. The Duke looked around enthusiastically, looking into the distance, as his wife was not there yet, and she should have been teleported already. Adeline's cheerful laughter and her joyful admiration for the beautiful trees were heard. The bright light and the wonderful place. Ray and Astor were perplexed as they saw night and darkness, but it turned out that Adeline saw light and the bright colors of the day. When everyone calmed down, our heroine asked to make a couple of proposals. The Duke frowned and asked his wife if she had the right to do so. Smiling, the girl confirmed that she had that right, since the Duke himself needed something from her, and she did not expect to get it for free. Perplexed, Ray once more looked inquisitively at his wife and asked if she was really a clairvoyant. Adeline froze, thinking how to answer this question to her husband, who already believed that she was a clairvoyant. Thoughts came one after another, and our heroine decided that she would live as a clairvoyant, since there was no reason to correct this misunderstanding. Adeline informed Duke Horace Bensark that she wished to receive proper treatment, and according to her abilities, and that she would not change her surname and would live as Adeline Lutt. Duke Bensark thought again and again about his wife's words that she refused to change her surname, and would live as Adeline Lutt. Astor Leff informed him that Adeline had understood everything since the ceremony, and reminded him that she was married to the Duke, and that therefore she should bear her husband's surname. Our heroine laughed at his words, assuring him that she knew that. Otherwise, she would not be here, to which she received complete astonishment from the Duke's friend. Astor, perplexed, said that if Adeline continues to use her maiden name, then they will continue to court her, and this will look bad from the outside, and the girl was touched by such concern for her. Smiling, Adeline asked not to worry about her now, since she would not pay the slightest attention to what others thought, and said that it would be great if they started doing this earlier, more precisely when discussing marriage. Astor looked sadly at the girl, and thoughtfully clarified that his captain, as he called Ray, thought the same as her, and then the Duke, turning to his wife, told her that he agreed, and that he would do whatever she wanted. Adeline smiled cheerfully, thus confirming Astor's words, but the Duke did not smile. He thought about his wife's proposal, agreeing that it was not bad, but at the same time noting that it bothered him very much. Adeline's offer was quite beneficial for the Duke, as it saved him unnecessary work. This is how he reasoned, examining the tips of his shoes. But for the same reason, he really didn't want to allow her to do this. Seeing his friend's torment, Aster tried to persuade the girl to refuse this offer, to which she said with a sad smile that they should have treated her well from the beginning. Having made a difficult decision, Adeline said that in front of the public she would behave like the Duchess of Bensark, but in private with her and the Duke's people, she would be Adeline Lawton, and added that she also had a weakness for wedding ceremonies. Our heroine smiled dreamily and asked her husband for permission to hold a tremendously spectacular ceremony whenever she wanted. Adeline looked at Ray and suggested that before the wedding ceremony, they consider themselves allies and pretend that they were already married. The Duke accepted the offer, shaking his wife's hand, but thought that for some reason he himself was not satisfied with this offer. Not far away, a cry of joy was heard about the quick return, and everyone saw a guy running towards them. The boy, delighted and even somewhat enthusiastic, suggested seeing the Duchess in front of him, and immediately added that it was a great honor for him to meet her. Adeline looked closely and remembered that it was Maven, the butler of the Bensark house. The girl looked at the butler, and the thought crossed her mind that he was the only one who took care of her in the duchy. And then, a bright image flashed like lightning in our heroine's head. The dark tentacles of a huge squid wrap around Maven's arms and legs, his desperate resistance, and the last of the air leaving his throat. Adeline tried to understand what it was, whether it was a forgotten memory or an image of the future. The girl stood still. Tears streamed down her face, and she didn't immediately realize that someone was persistently calling her. The butler looked anxiously at the Duchess's face and called her, trying to find out if everything was all right with her. Since she had become very pale, Adelaide smiled reassuringly at Maven and whispered to him that she was fine, just suddenly felt dizzy. But again, images appeared in dark spots in our heroine's head, and she remembered that Maven had died. But the most surprising thing was that these memories appeared suddenly. Maven looked at the Duchess with concern, as she was frightening him with her appearance. Adeline thanked the butler for his concern and asked him to call her by her name. Maven was simply surprised. He apologized to the girl and tried to say in bewilderment that he did not dare to call Duchess Bensark by her precious name. The girl assured him that her name was not so precious that he could not pronounce it, so let him bravely call her Adeline. And the girl thought to herself that the past remains in the past and that she will not allow events to repeat themselves. But then the Duke abruptly interrupted their dialogue and told his butler to do as the Duchess wished. Our heroine, to ease the awkward moment, offered her friendship to Maven. He agreed and in return offered to travel in a carriage. And then Adeline turned her attention to her husband, Duke Bensark, who was preparing to go somewhere. The girl, slightly embarrassed, asked where he was going because he was supposed to accompany her. The Duke stopped and did not turn around for a long time, as if reflecting on some decision. Then he approached Adeline and, offering her his hand, told her to follow him. Ray led the girl to the carriage, which was decorated with monograms and gold patterns, and the step treads were lined with red brocade. Aster sat next to Maven in the coachman's seat, which made him very happy because he wanted to talk about the Duchess. And turning to his interlocutor, he thoughtfully suggested that the Duchess was quite an unusual lady. Smiling at these words, Aster agreed that she was a tough nut to crack, and the butler also said thoughtfully that this was the first time he had seen the master sigh like that. Aster looked at Maewyn with interest and tried to find out if the butler really only noticed this in the Duke's behavior, since he himself even found him confused. Maewyn exclaimed in surprise, as this was impossible for him. He could not imagine his master expressing emotion. Continuing the conversation, Aster confirmed his words, although all this was strange, and the butler said that many things can happen in life. Maven recalled how he came to the Duke's house as a child, and since then, he has never seen his face express emotion. Without setting aside his own memories, Maven assumed that something interesting was brewing. Meanwhile, the couple traveled in the carriage in complete silence, each thinking about their own thing, and glancing at each other from time to time, although the Duke did not hide his interest in his wife. The Duchess felt extremely uncomfortable traveling in the carriage, but tried not to show it, and did not show her displeasure in any way. The girl looked at the Duke, perplexed because he was constantly looking at her, and thought that maybe she should have asked to sit next to Maewyn. Adeline was angry with her husband for that inquisitive look, with which he seemed to try to read from her eyes what she was thinking, and mentally called him a monkey or an idiot. She doubted that it was possible to read thoughts in the eyes and to distract herself from the Duke. And from thoughts about him, she began to look out the carriage window, noticing that the lands, as usual, were arid. Our heroine remembered that a little deeper, in the forest of darkness, are the walls of the palace. And as soon as you enter, the main residence and the Black Tower will appear, and there are the servants' quarters. And the stables. Adelaide thought about the people of the duchy, because they are not at all interested in cultivating the land. And turning to her husband, she pointed out that he had completely abandoned this territory, and she had a feeling that all these fertile lands were wasted. Ray looked at his wife in surprise, trying to understand what she meant. The girl pointed out the window and said that these lands are only used as a road for carriages to pass. And she thought it would be great to place a lush garden on these lands, and looked inquisitively at her husband, waiting for his decision. The Duke, without thinking twice, immediately replied, even with some indifference, that the Duchess was free to do whatever she wanted. Adelina immediately took advantage of his permission and decided to clarify to her husband that it was even possible to plant a garden that would eclipse even the imperial one in its beauty. Ray sighed deeply and said, without hiding irony, that she would do it her way anyway, and that she was only restraining herself for some strange reason. Adeline, in her heart, laughed heartily at his words, because she could not understand why Ray was calling her to moderation for some strange reason. Then our heroine drove in silence and thought that it turns out talking is very easy. And then she wondered why she restrained herself so much in her past life. Because it is not in vain that people say that the most important thing is the ability to get along. Thinking this way on the way and looking into the distance from the window, Adeline assured herself that now she could do whatever she wanted. And the carriage, pulled by 2 horses, traversed the vastness of the duchy, carrying not only the Duke and the Duchess, but also their thoughts and reflections. The girl understood that exactly what she deserved was happening to her now, and since this happened, she would do everything she dreamed of in a past life. Our heroine closed her eyes and began to think about what tree she would plant in the garden, what flowers she would grow in the flower bed, and she also eagerly awaited tomorrow. The servants awaited the master of the castle and came out to meet them, and since they knew that he would bring a young wife, they greeted the Duchess, expressing their goodwill and showing that they were very happy to serve for her. Adeline was delighted to see how the servants of Duke Bensark greeted her, especially when the butler immediately suggested starting preparations so that she could rest. The Duchess, with a smile on her face, said that she was leaving all preparations to him, since she was a little tired. Like a true, well-trained servant, the manager invited the Duchess to follow him and, showing her the way, he began to climb the castle stairs. Mavin immediately revealed the secret of the girl's residence, saying that her large room is on the 3rd floor, which is perfectly lit by the sun, and most importantly, is located next to the master's bedrooms, so she will feel safe. To which the Duchess simply laughed. Adeline looked at the butler and thought how happy she was that Maywin was alive. Walking behind the manager, our heroine did not look out the street and continued to think that there was someone in the mansion willing to support her. And this was a great relief. The manager stopped in front of one of the doors and said that this was her room. Adeline entered her room, examined the situation, and stated with relief that she was finally here. Memories flooded her like a whirlwind, reminding her that these chambers in her past life did not belong to her, but to the woman who became the owner of the house instead of her. Adeline remembered how once, when Ray returned home after a long absence, this woman was with him. In Adeline's memories, she was a beautiful woman with scarlet hair and a bold gaze, and her name was Hella Alton. The girl sighed sadly, remembering that Jella took her rights for granted, and then Adeline swore to herself that this time she would not lose her rights. Her thoughts were interrupted by a knock, and Ray entered through the door, who asked her if she liked this room. The Duke waited for an answer, and Adeline replied that the room was to her liking, but there was no sincerity in the answer itself, and Ray froze in surprise, also hearing the exclamations of amazement from Aster and Mabon. But he, with his characteristic restraint, was satisfied with the girl's answer, and let her rest. After some time, someone knocked on the Duchess's door, and she allowed entry. Mabon entered and immediately told her that he was very surprised today. Adeline tried to find out from the butler why he was surprised, and what was more interesting, why he was so surprised. From the butler's story, the Duchess realized that her master was not the type of person who paid attention to the feelings of others. And she wanted to know what he usually did in such cases. Maewyn told her that the Duke went straight to his room, to which Adeline laughed, saying that this was completely consistent with his character. The butler said with a sigh that the Duke, of course, was not a bad person. He just had a slightly rude character. The girl smiled, looked at Maven with understanding, and said that she would believe him if he said so. But then, as if reasoning and considering his words, she added that, however, the Duke is cold and calculating, and that usually such people are considered terrible. And the butler, to avoid further conversation, added that if the Duchess wants something, that she should ring the bell and a maid will come to see her. Maven, having come to his senses, wanted to know if the Duchess wanted dinner. And the girl was surprised and asked if the time had already come. Adeline was still thinking and decided that she would refrain from lunch for now, since even without lunch, there was a lot to prepare while resting. The butler clarified that perhaps the Duchess would join dinner, otherwise she needed to work. The girl reacted with understanding to the butler's words and told him not to worry about her, and that he should go and do his job. Mabon left the Duchess's chambers and, wishing her a good rest, left. A knock on the door interrupted Adeline's rest, and, waking up from her thoughts, she let the knocker in. A girl entered the room and introduced herself, saying that her name was Catherine, and that she was the Duchess's personal maid. The name of this girl passed through Adeline's memories, and, looking at her maid, she saw that she was standing straight, curtsying. The Duchess let Catherine stand up, and with a smile asked her to take care of her. The maid, without lifting her head, confirmed her readiness to take care of her mistress, and added in a low voice, asking her to take care of herself. Adeline closed her eyes, remembering that at their first meeting, Catherine showed her respect, and soon began to despise her. And wondering why this was happening, she looked at the maid and asked how old she was. In silence, timidly, under the Duchess's gaze, the maid replied that she was 22 years old. And Adeline, cheering up Catherine, said that for now she could be free, and that if something happened she would call her. The maid, with the same silence and without lifting her head, replied that she was listening, and that she would go with the Duchess's permission. Our heroine, saying goodbye to the girl and taking care of her, thought that she had really made a mistake. And what should she do? Because the maid's reaction was alarming. Leaving the room and passing by a stand with flowers, Catherine snagged the hem of her dress on the stand, and the flower pot leaned dangerously. The maid cried out in fear, because she could unintentionally break her master's thing. And at that moment, the Duchess looked at this whole situation from the other side. Adeline rushed to help the maid, as she instantly realized that the fragments of the broken pot could fly out, injure the girl, or she could slip, and this was very dangerous. The pot fell with a loud crash, broke into many pieces, and water spilled onto the floor. Adeline picked up the girl and held her in her arms, preventing her from falling, and the maid was simply amazed by the Duchess's act. A little later, the Duchess and the maid got up, and the latter lamented over the fragments of a broken vase, saying that this vase was worth 10 months' salary. And what should she do now? And what should she do? Catherine, crying, biting her lips and wringing her hands, apologized to the Duchess, and repeated that it was all due to her clumsiness. Adeline, calming the maid, said that she was not worried about the chamber pot, but about her, about Catherine, and that she was very worried that she might get hurt. The maid could not believe that her mistress was worried about her, because this had never happened to anyone before. Catherine kept asking for forgiveness and making excuses, saying that it was all due to her clumsiness. And Adeline calmly told her that everyone makes mistakes, and there is nothing to worry about. And since she was not injured, then everything is fine. Returning to bed, the Duchess told the girl not to worry about the vase, and to take care of her business, and that they would call her in the evening. The maid looked at her mistress in amazement. Several thoughts passed through her head, and hesitantly she thanked the Duchess. Having already left the Duchess's chambers, Catalina stopped at the door, and thoughtfully she told herself that her lordship was a wonderful girl. Then, walking through the mansion corridors, the girl recalled what had just happened to her, and was amazed by the Duchess's action, as she did not expect the Duchess to be like that, and immediately scolded herself, saying that it was stupid to be jealous. After learning about her marriage to the Lord, Catherine remembered her mistress, noting that she was as beautiful as a doll, and also remembering how the Duchess worried about her. The girl could not believe that she was the personal maid of such a mistress, and how happy she was to serve with her. In a good mood, Catherine walked with a goal, to tell everyone how beautiful and stunning the Duchess is. The girl even laughed happily at her own thoughts, and promised herself that she would make the Duchess the most respected person in the mansion. But Adeline, in her room, nervously listening to her feelings, tried to understand why her ears suddenly lit up. Maybe because someone was remembering her. At that moment, the Duke was standing in his room and looking at the wall, thinking about his wife. Who was in the next room? Unintentionally, our hero repeatedly returned to thinking about his Duchess, reflecting on the proposal she had made to him before arriving at the duchy. And before arriving at the mansion, his wife suggested that they consider themselves allies and pretend that they were already married. Ray, sitting at the table in his room, kept thinking about Adeline's words, and for some reason felt uneasy in his soul. Our hero looked at the wall in front of him, imagining his wife and knowing that she was not far away, close, just behind this wall. Ray immediately forced himself not to think about the Duchess, wondering what would happen if she were just a few steps away from him. But the memories burned his memory, because our hero never forgot what happened on that memorable day. The Duke remembered Adeline, recalled her appearance, her smile, and looked for reasons not to think about her, since he had no desire to worry about such a girl. But hunched over the papers on his desk, Ray could not understand why these thoughts bothered him so much. And why they bothered him so much. Astor knocked on the door and asked permission. He entered his friend's office and interrupted his thoughts, to which the angry Duke asked him what was wrong. The angry tone did not bother Astor, and he said he wanted to talk about plans for the future, and also ask what the captain was thinking about. Ray looked sadly at his friend and said that if he intended to talk nonsense, then it would be better for him to leave. But if he wanted to talk about the prophecy, then that was another matter. Astor laughed, looking at the gloomy captain, teasing him, as if he had just remembered the prophecy. Ray expressed his displeasure, because the woman said she would open his eyes, and maybe this means he will be able to distinguish between devas and asuras, to which Astor tried to clarify, although the question was not about that, but whether the captain really is. Call Adeline another name like this woman. The guy tried to convince the Duke that if he kept addressing her like that, the servants would despise her. And now she was a duchess. Ray replied irritably that the title of duchess was not important at the moment, since they had many other things to discuss. But Astor, not paying attention to the Duke's irritation, disagreed with him, and said that this was the most important topic that needed to be discussed. Astor reminded the captain that from the moment of the wedding ceremony, Adeline is his family. Perhaps the captain forgot, but people usually live and build relationships in the family. Astor also mentioned that people get engaged, marry, and thus create a family, and have children. But the Duke stopped his monologue about family and reminded his friend that he knew all this very well, and that he had no desire to play house. Suddenly, clenching his fist tightly, as the memory rushed into him at lightning speed, the Duke said that he already knew what As was trying to tell him, but that now it was the year 512. Ray, gritting his teeth and reliving the memories once more, said that after the celestial war against the demons ended with the defeat of the devas, they lived only for the rebirth of the celestial kingdom. Our hero also told his friend that 60 years had already passed since he barely managed to wake up Oz and Wakon, but they couldn't even trace the footsteps of the other devas. And frozen like a statue, the Duke froze when the image of a red-haired woman suddenly appeared before his eyes. Ray thought for a long time, covering his eyes with his hand and thinking. He said that the information about the Demon King and the entrance to the demon realm had become even scarcer. Looking at the bookshelves, as if trying to find answers to his questions in them, the Duke asked Astor if there was any news from Wakwind. At that moment, Astor was thinking about the devas and thoughtfully asked the captain where they found traces of the devas who entered the rest. But when he came to his senses, the young man answered the Duke's question, saying that Bakon had contacted them, but he did not convey any useful information to them. Astor also added angrily and irritably that they found traces, but could not stay there for long due to the extreme cold. And immediately dismissing his irritation and calming down, Astor added to the Duke that this is why it is better to leave these things to him. And Ray, listening to his friend's indignation, tried to understand this situation. And reflecting, he spoke about Wakana's stupidity and about the fact that they have no patience at all, and they are very crybabies. Astor agreed with the Duke about the intolerance of his friends, but in any case, he added that since they had returned, they needed to go to the ice lands. Our heroes thought for a long time about the situation, when Astor announced that unification would be the best option for the Duke. Duke Horace Bensark became thoughtful. Then he got up and looked at his right hand, in whose palm a small shining ball burned, and concluded that he had no choice, as he had little divine energy left. Ray clenched his fist tightly, as if trying to hold onto and not let go of this small ball. The Duke immersed himself in memories, and the woman's words that she could use magic came to his memory, and immediately wondered if it was possible to be a prophet and use magic. But the question remained unanswered. The terrible truth appeared before the Duke, that the tree of life of the Devas was dead. And immediately, another thought came to him that the tree of the Asuras should also be weakened, while his head was hidden. Reasoning that the tree of life had died, Ray realized that this was the reason why divine beings and demonic beings who could use magic disappeared from this world. Our hero also understood that the tree is a source of divine and demonic power, and when it dries up, the power naturally disappears. And because the Asuras and Devas have the same roots, they cannot say for sure whether divine power is used by demonic force. In the memory of the prophecy, Ray recalled that only Adeline Lutton is the one who sees the truth and can open her eyes. Our hero came more and more to the conclusion that this was very curious, but he still could not understand what this prophecy meant. The Duke also wondered if Adeline's ability to perform magic was also related to the prophecy. In his thoughts, Ray wondered what it meant to say that Adeline could see the truth, and maybe she could see divine and demonic power. Moreover, our hero, remembering his wife, thoughtfully tried to understand himself, and wondered what the reason was that he felt strange and uncomfortable when he looked into Adeline's eyes. The sun was setting, illuminating the vaults and reflecting in the windows of the old mansion. Adeline opened her eyes and lay back on the sofa without thinking, because she didn't want to think about anything. After all the events, it took her a long time to come to her senses. But over time, thoughts began to enter our heroine's head, and she, looking at the canopy above her head and looking around, wanted to know where she was. Seeing the familiar surroundings, Adeline came to the conclusion that she had returned to the Bensarka Duchy, and, if you think about it, it turns out to be funny. The girl, looking out the window at the setting sun, remembered that she had died, but still returned to life, and went back in time. This means Adeline reasonably realized that she must find the strength to live again. A knock on the door distracted our heroine from her thoughts, and she heard the voice of the maid Catherine. With permission, the maid entered the Duchess's chambers and stopped at the door, afraid to lift her head and look at her mistress. All this without lifting her head. Catherine said that she had come to ask if the Duchess could cook something to eat, to which Adeline replied that the maid had arrived in time because she was about to call her. Catherine, without lifting her eyes and without looking at her hostess, tried to clarify with her whether to take the Duchess to the dining room or bring food to the room. Adeline said that she would eat in the hall, but she couldn't look at the room like that, and she asked Catherine if she could help her. The maid stood with her head bowed, still amazed by the Duchess's behavior, because no one had treated her like this before, and then she heard the Duchess's voice, who asked her if she was really going to stand there frozen. Catherine said in a trembling voice that she herself did not dare to approach such a high-ranking person. The maid glanced at her mistress from under her eyebrows and felt mixed feelings towards her. Our heroine, to cheer up the girl, asked her to lift her head, as she did not like talking to a person, looking at the crown of the head, and when the maid looked at the mistress, Adeline added that such a charming face should not disappear. Seeing a shy smile on her maid's face, the Duchess, heading towards the closet, called her to help her get dressed. Adeline stood for a while and looked at the empty closet, noticing that her dress was wrinkled, and she needed to change before going down to the dining room. The maid exclaimed in fright and began to apologize to the Duchess for not having time to prepare the outfits for her. Immediately Catherine, fearing that the hostess's anger would now spill over onto her and get into trouble, suggested that they immediately go buy something. Adeline looked at the girl and was very surprised, asking her if she could really enter the capital's clothing store at such a late hour. Catherine, realizing that she had said something stupid, and that, in fact, the store was already closed, lowered her head. But the Duchess, looking at the girl, tried to calm her by telling her that everything was fine, and that she did not blame her. And then Adeline added that since the estate was managed by the Duke, all the blame was entirely his for not having prepared everything necessary for his bride. And after thinking for a little while, she asked the maid to call Amuin. Catherine immediately hurried to carry out her mistress's orders, saying while walking that she would do everything in an instant. And our heroine, waiting for the butler, walked around the room from corner to corner, and thought that she still had a lot of work to do. After thinking a little more, Adeline came to the conclusion that it would be necessary to teach Ray how he should treat the mistress of the house. A knock on the door interrupted Adeline's thoughts, and the butler entered her room. Smiling and cheerful as always, he introduced himself, reminding himself. Mavin said that they told him that the Duchess had called him to ask about her dress, and the Duchess had confirmed that she had a request for him. Adeline asked the butler if he could bring her His Excellency's clothes, as she needed to change, and her dresses were not yet ready for her. The butler looked at his mistress in amazement and could not understand if he had understood her correctly, and he asked again, clarifying whether she really needed the Duke's clothes. The Duchess confirmed that she needed the clothes of the person who caused this situation, and since the Duke did not take care of her clothes, it did not mean that she would wear anything. Maywin and Catherine looked at their mistress with holy horror, and Adeline, amused, added that since such a situation had developed, the Duke should also be punished, so she needed to bring his best clothes. Catherine tried to understand if Maywin and she had heard their Duchess's order, since this was not within any framework, to which Maywin replied that he understood correctly. However, Mavin tried to reason with his mistress, saying that he was trying to turn the Duke into a normal person, to which Adeline replied with a laugh that there are no bad dogs. First, you just need to resolve the issue of hierarchy. Catherine looked at the Duchess with admiration and repeated that this was simply incredible, and that her mistress was incredible. Here Mavin exclaimed, delighted that he understood everything, and that he would prepare everything now. And Catherine added that she would bring someone who knew how to sew and could adjust the clothes to the Duchess's figure. Adeline looked at the butler and the maid with a smile, and realized that they were more interested in the idea than she was. When the servants left, our heroine thought that life was full of events that she could not even imagine before. The Duchess remembered her past life, and then her dressing room was empty, and she had to go down once, and again to the dining room in wrinkled dresses. And in her past life, Adeline remembered, she never thought of asking Mavin for help. Likewise, in our heroine's memories, her maid Catherine never looked at her with such kindness. And Adeline thought deeply about the reason why she could change so easily. And at that moment, the Duke could not understand his butler's request, asking once and again if this woman really needed his clothes. Mavin confirmed that if it were before, he would have gone to the store to buy dresses for the Duchess, but now she simply has nothing to wear. Ray, to extinguish his outburst of anger, crumpled the paper he had just been writing on, and surprised, he asked the butler why the Duchess needed his clothes. Having calmed down a little, the Duke, as usual, began to reason when solving difficult problems, asking why not find a maid of similar build and wear her dress. At that moment, the butler could not stand it, and allowing his voice to be raised to his master, he shouted that this was simply unacceptable. Maywin looked at the Duke angrily, and loudly reprimanded him that such a suggestion could not even be uttered, since it would be extremely insulting to force the lady to wear a servant's dress. The Duke was surprised by the butler's temper, but realized that his Duchess could not wear a servant's dress, but his clothes, and was immediately surprised by her choice, since the clothes were men's. And Mavin, looking at his master with a smile, asked if the Duke knew what they say among the people, and immediately answered that a marriage is one in soul and body. Ray looked sadly at his butler, and thought that this cheeky little yesterday could not even look at him. But today he was not only arguing, but also trying to teach. Our hero suddenly remembered Adeline. He remembered her magnificent figure, her walk, her movements. Moreover, imagining his wife dressed as a man, he agreed that such clothes would suit her well. Meanwhile, Adeline was trying on men's clothes and looking at herself in the mirror. Catherine looked at her mistress with delight, exclaiming from time to time, "How beautiful my lady is." The dresses suited the Duchess indeed very well, as the maid constantly told her, repeating that these dresses suited her very well, and that my lady looked like a young nobleman. Adeline looked at herself in the mirror and simply did not recognize herself, as if seeing herself for the first time, and at the same time not herself, but she was pleased with Catherine's compliments and sincerely thanked her. After looking at herself enough, Adeline noticed that it was necessary to hurry to the dining room, since it was already very late, and Catherine replied that it would be done now. Our heroine, walking through the mansion corridors, thought that this time she was not hemming the clothes herself, but there was a person who would tailor the suit to her size. It's just wonderful, Adeline thought, that now she can delegate to others the tasks she previously had to do herself. but the feelings that our heroine experienced were strange. But at the same time there was a feeling of relief, as after taking off a suffocating corset. But looking at herself in a man's suit, Adeline came to the conclusion that she liked the look of these clothes more than she expected, and she decided that she would have to dress up more often. In the dining room, the Duchess was greeted by the butler, who began to say that they had just finished cooking. But suddenly he fell silent and could not finish his thought. Maven looked at his mistress dumbfounded and trying to clearly express his thoughts. He said that she was much more attractive than he thought, and exclaimed that she was even more attractive than Aster thought. At that moment, Aster, after hearing the butler's words, said that it was a very strange defeat for him in this situation. At the butler's words, our heroine laughed and asked that, in terms of attractiveness, he should represent Aster first and foremost, and not the Duke. Maven bitterly noted that there was no need to say anything about his grace, as he was attractive, but his speech left much to be desired. But still, the butler continued to reflect, there is something charming in a staff. Like a prince, compared to the Duke, Marvin pointed out, one could say that Aster represents the stereotype of male attractiveness, and has a slightly different mold than the Duke. This is how Maewyn perceives it, Adeline thought, and said that she never found Aaz attractive, and she called Aster by a new name. Aster faked tears, and said that this was another strange defeat for him. To this, our heroine said that no matter how much she thought about it, she could not say anything. And then Maven turned to Adeline with a charming smile and told her that he had a question for her. The butler looked directly at the Duchess and slyly asked her if she obviously considered the Duke the most handsome. And that is true. Adeline angrily attacked the butler, believing that he was mocking her. But Maven, smiling, assured her that he would not do that. The Duchess, straightening up and squaring her shoulders, said that all this does not matter, and who cares about her beauty at all, and for her the most important thing is her status, since it is best to be rich, and it is important for her to be able to enjoy many things. The butler said with a bow that then the Duke would look even better, and that he would reproach him more often so that Adeline could enjoy wealth as she wished. Our heroine looked at Mabon with a malicious smile, and sitting down at the table, thanked him, and asked him to do his best in this matter. The Duchess thought to herself that there was a moment when she looked favorably upon Ray unconditionally, and that she wished she could tell Maven the whole truth, but in the end Ray killed her. These memories and thoughts overwhelmed Adeline, and she thought sadly that she was sitting here again. But she had a strange feeling. Adeline looked at the set table, put down her fork, and understood why it seemed strange to her, because now she was alone again, and the table was set only for her. Maven looked at his mistress with concern, trying to understand why she stopped eating. The butler did not understand what could suddenly happen that she stopped eating, and thought that maybe she would not tolerate some food. The boy immediately approached the Duchess with the question that she didn't like something, and if so, he would ask the cook to bring her the next dish. Adeline thanked the butler for his concern, because she was simply lost in thought, and then added, asking His Excellency if he would join the meal. The butler was confused, and choosing his words, said that the Duke would not join, since he usually prefers to eat alone in his chambers. The Duchess heard the answer, and said with a smile that Maven wanted to express that this is the kind of person he is. Our Duke, so let her understand, and not take it seriously. Maven looked at Adeline with fear, and sighed deeply realizing how close he was to the truth. The butler, confused, began to make excuses, saying that, as he clumsily said, he would definitely correct himself, to which our heroine laughed, expressing that there was no need to do this because she had done nothing wrong. Adeline, after thinking for a while, asked Maven to tell the Duke that in this property, regardless of what he used to do, she had no reason to accept or not take his actions seriously. Looking at the set table, she asked him to tell his lordship that since he had married her, she would like him to come down to eat immediately and talk with her. With a malicious smile, Adeline added that if the Duke decided to stay home, she would starve to death. Entering the Duke's room, who had already started eating, Maven conveyed his mistress's words, saying that if His Excellency did not come down to the dining room, the mistress would starve to death. Our hero looked at the butler dumbfounded, and not believing his words, asked several times if this woman had really said that. And Maven confirmed his message, saying that he clearly heard the words conveyed by the Duchess. Ray sighed deeply, looked at his desk and spoke slowly, expressing his thoughts on how troublesome she was. The butler looked at his master embarrassed, and said that at this rate, it would soon be said that Duke Bensark was starving his newborn wife. Mavin looked at the Duke and continued to express in a masterly tone that rumors that the Duke refuses to feed his wife would spread quickly, and this would dishonor the Bensark house, to which Ray angrily interrupted the butler and told him that he understood everything and maybe Mavin would stop teaching him. The Duke got up from the table and gave instructions to have it served below in the dining room, to which the butler exclaimed happily that it had been an excellent decision. His Excellency, Ray, heading to the dining room, was thinking about the need to find out how much his wife knew about them. And dinner would be an excellent opportunity for this. And besides, a crazy thought occurred to him that he really didn't dislike her. Adeline was sitting at the table waiting for the Duke, as they had already told her that he would dine with her. Lifting her eyes at the sound of the door opening, the girl looked at the man who entered, saying quietly, "You have come." Ray approached the table and stood motionless in his chair. He looked at his wife, not knowing what to do next, as he felt extremely uncomfortable. Adeline lowered her eyes, thinking that she would really not be able to find an approach to her husband, if this indifference would always be in his eyes. The Duke, overcoming his shyness, remembered that, after all, he was the owner of this castle. He pushed back his chair and sat down at the table, staring fixedly at the Duchess. Adeline decided that she was tired of feeling embarrassed. She looked at Ray and, smiling cheerfully, thanked him for the clothes, telling him that she would try not to spoil them. Ray noted that even though those clothes were men's, they suited her well. Our heroine looked closely at her husband, sighed, and asked him if that was all he could say. The Duke looked bewilderedly at his wife sitting opposite him, and simply did not understand what she wanted from him. Adeline realized that her Duke had absolutely no idea how to treat women. She reminded him that he was her husband, and that he shouldn't have said that the suit suited her very well, or that she looked beautiful. Ray, frowning, said that the Duchess was demanding a lot from him, and Adeline, continuing her declaration, added that if His Excellency does not like it, then he can go back home. And what will he do then? After all, it was the Duke who asked to marry her. "I haven't forgotten." Our heroine, cheering up, looked at her husband in amazement and continued to rant that if his lordship wanted to please her, he should do it, and she was extremely surprised, as she did not know that he was so insensitive. The Duke looked at Adeline beside himself with anger and thought that she was not going to stop. Despite all of Adeline's declarations, the Duke warned her that she was still acting like his wife, although she did not take his surname, and immediately added that the suit really suited her well. Adeline, humbly lowering her gaze, thanked Ray for the compliment and began to eat. But suddenly, interrupting the meal, our heroine looked at the Duke, as some of his words only reached her, and she arrogantly expressed why he still remembers how she refused to take his surname. And looking at the Duke's astonished face, she asked what it is. "Is it possible to file for divorce now?" A moment later, Adeline burst out laughing and said she was only joking, and suggested that they start the meal anyway. Otherwise, the whole conversation would get cold. Looking at her husband, Adeline wondered if Ray had ever listened to her as he listens now. And if not, then nothing terrible would happen if she were a little more persistent. While still observing the Duke, our heroine looked at him intently and indifferently whispered that she would call him Ray. The Duke almost choked on what he heard, surprised by his wife's impudence or courage. Ray frantically stabbed his fork into a piece of meat, trying to control his anger. Our hero was silent for a while, and having calmed down, he decided not to argue with the Duchess. And telling her whatever she wanted, he continued to eat. Seeing how readily his lordship agreed to her proposal, Adeline thought that perhaps this life would be a little different from the previous one. Wanting to consolidate her success, Adeline addressed the Duke, addressing him by name, and asked him to try calling her Adele, and asked if it was true that he didn't plan to keep calling her anything other than that woman. And that she is for sure. Our hero, after a moment of hesitation, sighed and tried to pronounce his wife's name. Here, like an image before our heroine's eyes, the image of a man appeared, and a voice called his name. Adeline raised her head, trying to understand what that image was and where it came from. And that voice, the girl froze, looking into the void in front of her, as if nowhere. And she heard an alarmed voice, trying to find out if everything was okay with her. The Duchess, to calm the situation, laughed and said that it was nothing, and that the salad turned out so delicious, to which Ray noted that she hadn't even touched the food. But Adeline's thoughts were far away, as she kept trying to understand what kind of voice that was at that moment. Our heroine was sure that she would never have forgot if Ray had called her by her name, since in 25 years this had never happened. Adeline was sure that Ray did not call her by her name, even if only fragments of memories remained. Adeline recalled an image of a man who appeared in her head and was very surprised, since she did not remember his face. Our heroine was trying to sort out her memories and could not understand why she did not remember Ray's face. Adeline returned to her memories again and again, and the cup in her hand trembled when she caught the desperation in Ray's voice. Or maybe she was mistaken. The girl was sitting on the terrace drinking tea, thinking about everything that happened today, when she heard footsteps and turned around. The Duke entered the terrace and, staring intently at his wife, asked her if it was true, and that she should call him by his name, to which Adeline, smiling, replied that she herself had suggested it to him. Ray, slightly embarrassed, replied that it didn't matter and that he wanted to ask her something. The Duchess was waiting for her husband's question, thinking that he might be interested, when she heard him ask how much she knew about them, and the cup in her hand trembled, almost spilling the tea. Our heroine, composing herself after a short silence, told him that she knew he was a deva, and she also knew about the war between the celestial and demon realms, and that the celestial realm had lost. Adeline said that the celestial war against the demons happened 512 years ago on this land, in the middle realm that people call home. And this is a neutral zone, located between the celestial and demon realms. The girl said that celestial devas and demon asuras frequently visited here and had fun. Adeline added bitterly to her story that the promise not to take over the middle realm had been broken. The Duchess sighed deeply and continued her story, saying that during a long war, the devas were defeated by the asuras. Adeline was silent for a while longer and said that Ray is the last leader of the devas. Darlas, our heroine, looked at her husband and said quietly that she had heard this story in a past life. Adeline raised her head and stared intently into the Duke's eyes and said that nothing more was said about him, so she wanted to hear his story. The Duchess, looking into the darkness, said that she had many dreams. Some she remembered perfectly, others very vaguely. And it was a lie, because she wanted to hear the Duke. Adeline reached out her hand to Ray to let him feel her determination, and told him that she couldn't remember everything. And that's why she wanted to hear his story, how he was born, how he lived. Our heroine also wanted to know what Ray plans to do next. What is it that he asked her about? Ray, looking down, was very surprised that the Duchess wanted to know about him, and his life in general. It's just that our hero never really thought about himself, since all his thoughts were only about how to avoid the gaze of the asuras and survive, as well as about taking revenge. Ray only thought about how to fulfill his desire to steal the tree of life. While telling the story, the Duke said with a thoughtful look that the past does not matter. Continuing his story, Ray sadly added that there was not much to tell. The Duke remembered his life and could not talk about it. He only said that he simply survived. Adelaide looked sadly at her husband, repeating his words that he simply survived. Then Ray raised his head, and having made up his mind, began his story. The Duke said that he was born from the Tree of Life a couple of months before the start of the war. So, Ray asked his wife if she knew that devas and asuras mature faster than people, and that 3 to 4 months are enough for them to look like a 6-year-old human child. It was then that the agreement between the devas and the asuras ended. So the Duke continued his story. Ray, entering memories, said that the devas and asuras tried to make the middle realm their own. Continuing his story, the Duke said that both sides ignored the rules of the gods. Ray said that initially the relationship between the devas and the asuras was not so bad. Our hero said that since people worshipped them, they classified the white devas as good and called the black asuras evil. Then Ray smiled and said that by nature, they are not far from people, and that everyone can be good and bad like people. That's why, the Duke added, sometimes we help people and sometimes we oppress them. Ray also said that they even condescended to reincarnate and live with people. So, our hero bitterly added that perhaps this is why everyone wanted to take over the middle realm even more. Adeline listened to her husband fascinated, and when he fell silent, she called him quietly. But Ray did not hear her, and without stopping remembering, he said that skirmishes occurred quite often, so that no one thought that they could last long. But soon the war spread throughout the Middle Kingdom. Then, a spasm ran across the Duke's face when he reported that the devas had begun to lose. With a hazy look, our hero said that this happened because the demon queen, Camilla, had been preparing for the war for a long time, and as a result, the asuras reached the celestial realm and burned the Tree of Life, their cradle. Ray said painfully that the divine power emanating from the Tree of Life was completely destroyed. And without power, the Devas quickly lost it. Our hero, as if reading a chronicle, said that in the midst of the war he was appointed successor to Darloth. But before he could receive instructions, Fabian, who was Darloth at that time, died. The Duke reported that this is how the position of head of the celestial realm suddenly fell upon him. Although it was difficult for him, Gray said that the Asuras continued to arrive to destroy all the Devas. Our hero remembered and said that his comrades and relatives simply died powerless. The Duke stopped, stared into space, and said that the surviving Devas fell into a deep hibernation, which they called a state of rest, in order to heal their wounds. So Ray looked meaningfully and said that, as the only survivor, he had to find them. Since in a series of failures, there was still a reason for joy, because the Demon Queen also fell into peace. Our hero thought about it and expressed his assumption that this was quite strange, because she was not seriously injured. But it was precisely the fact that the Queen fell into peace, said Ray, looking into Adeline's eyes, and it allowed him to hide and search for the Devas, and so he managed to find Az and Wacken. Adeline, interested in her husband's story, suggested that he probably found them in the Middle Realm. The Duke confirmed his wife's assumption and explained that since the Celestial Realm was destroyed, they could only sleep in the Middle Realm. Our heroine turned, looked into the distance, and pointed her hand at the extensions of the duchy, as if reflecting and at the same time guessing that these lands of darkness were not just his home. Ray continued his story, saying that people abandoned the lands of darkness, considering them sinister. But thanks to this, these places became a suitable place where they could gain strength. Adeline looked at her husband with interest and suggested that he was really planning revenge. Our hero confirmed this assumption and added that he would wake up all his comrades and regain power. Then, the image of a red-haired woman appeared before the Duke's eyes, and the thought flashed that he would do all this to kill Camilla. Reasoning, the Duke continued that after gaining his power, he would restore the Tree of Life. In our hero's clouded gaze, Adeline saw determination when he said that he would also rebuild the celestial realm, since that was his duty as Darlot. Adeline looked at her husband and mentally, with some pity, called him a fool. Our heroine remembered that in a past life, she believed that her position as Darlot would make her cold-blooded. The Duchess looked at Ray, remembering him, and realized that, in fact, he simply didn't notice much, since he had been alone for a long time. Adeline thought with pity of her husband, noting that he hadn't learned to express anger, but only stoically endured all adversities, and perhaps that's why his eyes were filled with sadness. Our heroine looked at the Duke and firmly said that he was extremely brave. Although he had probably been alone for a long time, Adeline reached out her hand and placed it on Ray's arm to demonstrate with this small gesture that she wanted to support him. And in confirmation, the heroine movingly said that from now on she will be with him, and that he should worry no more. Adeline squeezed her husband's hand tighter, as proof of everything she had just said. Our hero looked at the pillars of the arch and thought about his wife's words that he felt truly alone, and simply drove away the consciousness of it. The Duchess looked at her husband tenderly, understanding what was now happening in his soul, and what thoughts surrounded him. Ray looked at Adeline surprised, not realizing what was happening, and thought that this was really why he wanted to tell her everything about his past. Adeline looked down, pointed with her eyes and removing her palm, said quietly that this is why her hands get cold when he touches them. A month had passed since Adeline's arrival at the estate, and no one stood idly by, since the Duchess decided to remake many things in the mansion, and infected all the servants with her enthusiasm. Servants rushed throughout the house, and in one or another part of the house, instructions were heard that this flower should not be here, that the table should be taken to the hall, and that this tree, in general, should be moved to the training ground. Mabon watched as Adeline gave instructions to renovate the property and thought to himself that the Duchess, as soon as she looked around, she immediately gave instructions to everyone, and our heroine, inspired, continued to give instructions and pointed out to the butler that the garden also needed to be taken care of, since it was too neglected, and she asked Mabon to hire a gardener, as well as an architect. Mabon thought to himself that, when he informed his lordship of the Duchess's innovations, he received an automatic response that he should do whatever she wanted. The butler was perplexed, since such behavior was not typical of his master, and he was happy to fix up the property. With the arrival of the Duchess, the atmosphere in the palace changed, to the point that even the cook, who never left his kitchen, began to go out into the garden and looking at the other servants. said that he liked it very much, that it was getting livelier here. The people living in the mansion began to look happier. Laughter was heard everywhere, and the servants worked with pleasure. Mavin, looking around the garden and checking the work done, suddenly heard footsteps and an exclamation about what was happening here. The butler, trying to find out which of the strangers could have entered the estate, turned towards the voice. In front of the butler was Wacken, who, it is not clear how and from where he came, briefly told about the latest news that had happened. And at that moment, Aster presented the Duke with some of his ideas on how they should proceed with their plans, and what should be done. Suddenly, a scream filled the vaults of the mansion. Rapid footsteps were heard, and Wacken burst into the Duke's office without knocking. Wacken burst into the office without greeting those present, and shouted loudly that what he had discovered was indeed true. Angrily, without trying to hide his irritation, Wacken asked if it was really true. And the captain got married. Ray, without looking up from the papers, calmly confirmed that everything Wacken had learned was true. But Wacken could not control his anger and tried to find out from the Duke why he got married. When did he get married? Who did he marry? And where? Aster answered for the Duke, saying that the captain got married since she is a prophetess, that the ceremony took place about a month ago when Wacken was trapped in the ice lands, that the bride's name is Adeline, that she is an aristocrat from the Lothan family, and it's not worth going into details about how the wedding went. Wacken angrily interrupted Oz, telling him not to interfere since the appeal was to the captain, to which Aster replied that Wacken did not address him, but simply shouted at the captain. But Wacken did not listen to his friend, and continued to shout indignantly that he asked him not to interfere in the conversation. And in general, Oz should have prevented this marriage. But Aster already replied with irritation why he should prevent it, since it was he who insisted on this marriage. Here anger blinded Wakana, who became more and more furious and shouted that this should not be, and that Aster took away the opportunity from him, because it was he who had to find a worthy wife for the captain. Estelle was already tired of listening to Wacken, and he, irritated, asked him why he was bothering him, since he himself wanted to find a wife for the captain, so he would continue the search. Wacken and Aster stood up and looked at each other angrily, and it seemed as if thunder and lightning floated between them. Realizing that there was no way to fix this, Wacken turned around, and as he left, he said over his shoulder that he would rather go and look at her than stay with them. Aster watched his friend leave. The only thing he said was that Wacken, as always, causes such a fuss on each of his visits, and immediately realized and added, turning to the captain, if he wanted to stop him. The Duke reacted calmly to Asta's words and said that there was no need to stop Wakana. Let him be. Oz was not as calm as our hero, and suggested that anything could happen from this meeting, since Wacken was very unrestrained and could disrespect the Duchess. Smiling, Aster added that he believed that even a duke needed to treat the Duchess with respect, and he looked mischievously at Ray. Ray, smiling for the first time during this time, confirmed Aster's words, and said that even if they do nothing, the Duchess herself will calm down anyone, including Wakana. And to himself, our hero thought that this still bothered him, so later he would have to explain to Wakana how to behave with the Duchess. Wacken walked through the mansion's corridors and silently scolded Az, who allowed the captain to marry an unknown noblewoman to him. In his reasoning, Wacken was based on the fact that it was not just about the Duke's wife, but about the wife of Darloth himself. In search of his new wife, Wacken walked around the estate and mentally reprimanded Asta, telling him how he could solve such an important problem, while Wacken himself was in the ice lands. Seeing a young woman with servants in the distance, Wacken immediately decided that if she was nothing special, he would dismiss her immediately. Adeline tensed up, as if feeling threatened, and had a feeling that waves of negativity were approaching her. Approaching and seeing the servants respectfully talking to the young woman, I immediately realized that this was the Duchess. Adeline turned to the voice, shouting a disrespectful expression, and saw a young man with a threatening expression on his face approaching her. But the Duchess, not paying attention to the man who had approached, turned to the servants. She asked what was wrong and, trying to calm them down, sent everyone back to work and asked Catalina to prepare tea. Catherine, who fell in love with her lover, happily rushed to fulfill her instructions. Adeline continued to instruct her servants and did not pay attention to the approaching boy. And Wacken was angry and indignant at the same time, realizing that the Duchess was ignoring him. Wacken was the first to break down and shout, addressing the Duchess familiarly. and asking if she knew who he was. Adeline turned and in response asked the man if he knew who she was, or if he was allowing himself to be rude because he didn't know who was in front of him, and immediately demanded an answer, addressing him by name. Wakant became even more enraged and angrily asked who had called his name, and more importantly, why she was more important, why she spoke to him disrespectfully. But the Duchess no longer allowed herself to be easily intimidated and demanded that Wakant answer her question first and tell her if he knew who she was. Laughing in her face, Wakant mockingly said that although in front of him was a new great Duchess, she was just an ordinary human girl. Our heroine looked harshly at Wakant and confirmed that she was the new Duchess, and proudly said that she was Adeline Lawton, the wife of Duke Horace Bensark. Adeline looked severely at Wakant and continued, adding that she was the Duke's wife, whom he served. Without allowing Wakant to come to his senses, the Duchess continued by saying that Bacon had just disrespected his master's wife and, therefore, he didn't respect him either. Looking at Wakant's angry face, Adeline severely asked him if he was really going to continue treating the Duke this way. Having lost some of his ardor, Wakant, confused by such harsh pressure, replied that he respected his captain very much. Then Adeline's gaze froze, as if she had seen something incredible. Our heroine looked at the hilt of the sword, which was sticking out from behind Wakant's back, and a thought flashed through her mind. Adeline turned to Wakant, as if hesitating or remembering, pointing to the sword, and saying that it was the holy sword Nakargras. The man, not yet over his anger, but still with a degree of amazement, asked her how she knew about this sword. Adeline looked closely at Wakana, and after thinking for a while, replied that Ray really didn't say she was a prophetess. Wakant was stunned by her answer, as he did not believe what he heard, and asked the Duchess again. So, was it really true that she was a prophetess? The Duchess, lowering her gaze and as if thinking, told Wakana that he considered himself a devoted servant, but that he doesn't even bother to listen to what his master tells him. Wakant realized that he was in a very bad situation for him, and began to think about how to get out of it with dignity. And Adeline continued the story that this sword personifies power, honor, and strength, and symbolizes heroism, loyalty, and unwavering will. Then the Duchess looked Wakana in the eyes and added that now this sword is asleep, but she can wake it up. Wakant stood up and looked silently at the girl, because he still could not believe that she was a prophetess. And then he heard the Duchess ask him if she woke up the sword, he would then recognize her as his Duchess. Here Wakant froze and disdainfully asked to really wake up the sword, but this was not given to him. Wakant said that the sword fell asleep when the tree of life of the celestial realm died, and until the tree comes back to life, the sword will not wake up. And looking at our heroine, since he did not recognize her as a prophetess, he asked if a simple person could cope with awakening the sword. Adelaide suggested that he would lose nothing if they tested Wakant with this sword. Our heroine was silent for a moment, arranging her thoughts, and then she said that Wakant was not originally the owner of the sword, since the previous owner was Commander Fabian. Wakant was simply stunned by what he heard, since none of the people knew this information. And then the man began to say that Commander Fabian lost his sword in battle, and only recently managed to find it. Wakant looked at the girl and continued his story, saying that this sword is important not only to him, because the real owner of the sword is the commander himself. So Wakant looked hopefully at Adeline and asked her in a choked voice if this was really true, and that he could awaken the sword. Looking down, Wakant said that he would keep this sword because it had lost its light. But when power returned to the sword, he wanted to give it to the captain. Handing the sword to the Duchess, Wakant said that he wanted to rephrase his question. Wakant looked closely at our heroine and asked if she could really return this sword to our Darlot. Adeline took the sword in her hands, getting used to its weight, and thought about the best way to answer. The Duchess looked up and convincingly said that since Wakant wanted it so much, she would allow it to happen. Wakant fell silent because he didn't know what else to say in this situation, but Adeline said she wanted to add something else. Adeline waited, and when Wakant looked at her, she said that the reason she was trying to wake up the sword was because she wanted Wakant to protect her Darloth with it. The heroine took the sword in her hands, pointing to the huge crystal with which the sword was decorated. That's why she wants to do what she just said. And then the sword shone with a kind of fantastic light, but Adeline, without letting go of it from her hands, began to enchant it in an incomprehensible language, but Wakant exclaimed in astonishment when he heard it, since the Duchess pronounced the Deva's speech. Adeline, without taking her eyes off the sword, kept talking and talking, putting all her energy into this spell. Backwin looked at the Duchess, and thoughts passed through his head, and these thoughts were one more unthinkable than the other, since he saw that such a ritual was impossible for a simple person to perform, which means that the Duchess was not just a person. But then he couldn't figure out who she was. The crystal of the sword lit up with a bright fire, and this meant that the sword had awakened. But Wacken had not yet seen it, although he was fascinated by this phenomenon. Adeline, straightening her shoulders, called Wacken and holding out the sword to him, told him to take it. Since this sword was now his, the heroine stared at the man, in whose gaze there was no longer any malice or anger, and wanted to know if he trusted her now. Thoughts were confused in Wacken's head, and he asked himself the same question, in which he asked how this happened and why she was the prophetess. The young man looked at the Duchess and still could not understand why she was the prophetess. Although she was only a woman, looking at the heroine's fragile figure, Wakana was surprised by how small she was. Much smaller than him. Going through all these factors, Wacken could not understand for himself that everything that happened was true, and that this small and fragile woman, on top of everything else, had such a strong appearance. Wacken, straightening his shoulders, approached Adeline with a firm step and, first of all, apologized for his rudeness and also asked permission to express his belated respect to Duchess Adeline Bensark. Then the man, bending his knee, introduced himself, saying his full name Wacken Hein, and humbly said that he would follow the Duchess's instructions with the help of this sword, and he would protect Darlath at all costs. Adeline gracefully accepted Wacken's apologies and assurances, and said that she also wanted to introduce herself to him. The Duchess, smiling, said that her name was Adeline Lawton, and that she really hoped they would get along. And then, after thinking for a moment, the Duchess asked him to call her by her first name from now on. The Duke and Astor were still in the office when Wacken entered with a confused look. Astor looked at his friend and shouted indignantly that he looked even stupider now than when he left here. But Wacken paid no attention to his friend's angry words, continued to stare blankly, and even the malicious words that perhaps Adeline hit him or something like that had no effect. Ray was already looking at the young man with alarm and could not understand the reasons for such behavior. At this point, Astor, turning to the Duke, suggested that Wacken was most likely ill, and he sought confirmation of his words in the Duke's gaze. But Wacken remained silent, only intermittently addressed the captain and thought about how to find words to express all his emotions. Unexpectedly, Wacken drew the sword from its scabbard. Somehow he solemnly raised it above his head and exclaimed for everyone to watch closely. The Duke and Astor looked bewildered and with a kind of sacred horror at the glittering sword in Wacken's hands, and the silent question of how this was possible froze on their lips. Suddenly, Astor froze and exclaimed, "How did this happen?" He looked at the Duke, and Ray looked at the sword with fascination and began to express his guess. But he froze halfway through the sentence. Wacken confirmed the captain's guess, clarifying that this holy sword remained inactive until he met Adeline, and then it began to shine after she hit it a couple of times. Ray looked at Wacken in amazement and asked again, clearly pronouncing every word, that Adeline really did this. Vaquant reconfirmed the Duke's words, saying that the Duchess made it shine, but at first he thought that the tree of life was beginning to grow again on our side. But then he rejected this hypothesis, since then you yourself would have felt it. Continuing his narration, Wacken said that when Aaz said Adeline was a prophetess, he considered it nonsense, but upon hearing how she uses the speech of the Devas, the doubts disappeared completely. Then Astor shouted at Wacken why he always runs into a fight, even without having a reason for it. Turning to his companion, Wacken asked him surprisedly if Az really wanted to fight him. But now he has a holy sword, to which Astor shouted that even if he didn't have that weapon, Wacken is not worthy to hit him once, and suggested that we go to the training ground. And our hero, not paying attention to the disputes of his friends, reflected on the fact that it turns out Adeline speaks the language of the Devas. And it was simply incredible. Ray, imagining the image of a little girl, thought that his wife had certain qualities. In his reasoning, the Duke analyzed all the known information and knew that people can learn the languages of the Devas and Asuras, but they cannot speak them. The Duke knew that only human prophets were capable of speaking ancient languages. This means, reasoned our hero, that Adeline is a prophetess, and that's why he rushed to marry. But something bothered him, and he couldn't understand what. Adeline, not knowing what was happening within the walls of her husband's office, walked calmly in the garden, and gave herself over to memories. In fragments of our heroine's past life memories, Wakan appeared, who looked sadly at the dark crystal on the sword. An image appeared in Adeline's memories of a red-haired woman standing next to a sword and pronouncing an enchantment. Adeline also remembered how a red-haired woman handed a shining sword to Wakan. And this woman was Jella, who woke up the sword in a past life. Our heroine believed that she had no special qualities, that she would be useless to her husband, but she immediately recovered and said that this time she had awakened the sword. Adeline could only honestly admit that she was lying when she said she could awaken the sword, since she didn't even expect to succeed. Then the heroine felt her hand begin to warm up, and looking, she saw that her hand was shining with that strange and fantastic glow, and she thought that everything was thanks to magic. The Duchess looked into the distance and saw the servants. She thought that she should not use magic in front of others like this time, which even Wakan was a little surprised by. Adelaide remembered that after has taught her magic in a past life, she practiced alone whenever she got the chance. And now, Adeline realized with satisfaction, she can use magic instantly, even without repeating the activation word. And that's how she was able to make the sword float. The heroine remembered that all these events happened 1 or 2 years before her death. In the memories in the castle hallway, the Duchess saw her husband and calling him. She asked him to wait. The heroine told Ray that she studied magic for his sake, but that she didn't have the opportunity to use it, and she could only show Ray what she could do to help him somehow. Adeline remembered how she, looking into her husband's eyes, tried to find out his opinion that she could use magic instantly. The heroine's memories also showed that the Duke asked her never to use this power in front of others. Adeline then looked at Ray with wide eyes, as she was very surprised by Ray's request. The girl thought then that the Duke did not believe in her abilities, and crying silently, she asked him why. The voices of the servants pulled Adeline out of her memories, but she kept remembering that, after that incident, she never used magic in front of others. And in fact, the magic she used in her past life was not something difficult. Reflecting on those moments from the memory, the Duchess noted that if Ray was not surprised by the magic itself, then the problem must have been that she did not say the activation word. Adeline looked at her hand, which was still shining, and thought that maybe she should say the activation word when using magic. Returning to her memories, the heroine thought that if this was a problem in the past, then nothing has changed now. Adeline kept trying to figure out why this should happen right now. The Duchess bitterly observed that if all her memories were intact, as they were, only isolated images appeared in her mind. Our heroine remembered the Duke's face again and came to the conclusion that, judging by his facial expression, he was scolding her, but she had a feeling that he was most likely worried about her. Suddenly, the Duchess was loudly called. Adeline looked up and saw her servants, and one of the maids was asking if they should bring a tea table here. The maid, named Rebecca, approached the Duchess and frankly, and with a kind of childlike delight, told her that Duke Benzarka's house had become so lively with the appearance of their mistress. The girl enthusiastically continued that everyone was incredibly happy with such changes, to which the heroine, smiling, quietly said that she was happy to know this. The maid was a very talkative girl and directly asked the Duchess if they were really building a training ground on the other side. Adeline confirmed the girl's words and said that she would hire new knights to help the Duke. Rebecca, even though the Duchess started having tea, continued to praise her and say that it's surprising, since she never stops inventing new things. The Duchess sadly thought that this was because her past life was boring, although she couldn't talk about it. But then the Duchess laughed and already said aloud that she wanted to take advantage of the situation to have Wakan teach her fencing. For the first time, the talkative maid was speechless. After hearing what the Duchess told her, she simply blinked and quietly asked if it was true. Adeline looked with pleasure at the obvious amazement in the girl's eyes, who, with a certain childlike spontaneity, could not hide it. The Duchess laughed and conspiratorially said that she actually dreams of becoming the best swordswoman wielding the famous sword, and that maybe she will succeed after training with Wakan, to which the maid laughed, taking all the mistress's words as a joke. But Adeline did not laugh. She just thought that her intonation was joking, but she definitely needed to learn fencing. Our heroine suggested that this would help hide the fact that she has magic, and taking advantage of this opportunity, she should get a famous sword, and with this sword, even if it's the Blade of Aura, people will be convinced that she is just a swordswoman. And again, the image from the memory before my eyes in which Adeline is behind Ray, and he tells her to hide behind his back. In this memory, the heroine saw herself with wide eyes and anxiety in them, with complete powerlessness and inability to help Ray. Adeline reflected for a long time on these memories and realized that she no longer wanted to hide behind her husband's back. And she also sincerely wanted to become stronger, so strong that no one could influence her. The maid looked at her mistress worriedly and realized that it was better not to bother her with empty words now. Addressing the Duchess, Rebecca, this time for some reason timidly, said that she was not sure what the Duchess was worried about, but that she really asked her not to need to do this. Seeing the perplexed look of her mistress, the maid said that the mistress was already strong enough, and no one would dare to pressure her. Looking at the Duchess, the maid smiled and enthusiastically said that the Duchess was the best. Adeline looked at Rebecca with disbelief, and seeing how much adoration was in the maid's eyes, she thanked her from the bottom of her heart. Astor looked at Ray and asked him if it was really necessary to take her with him. And then he turned around and asked that everyone had already forgotten how the captain almost died because of her. But the Duke remained firm, and without even reacting to his friend's indignation, he said she would come with us. Here Astor froze. He heard the noise outside the doors and squinting, asked for silence. Adeline, who entered the office, looked at everyone present, her eyes filled with tears, and thought to herself that she was very ashamed, and what could she do there? Our heroine remembered the cautious look that Wakon gave her when he said goodbye, and left, and Adeline increasingly remembered the red-haired girl. The Duchess understood that no one expected anything from her, but why did Ray keep taking her with him? But Ray almost interrogated her every day, asking what she had discovered today. Lowering her tear-filled eyes and looking down, the heroine replied every time that she did not recognize anything. And the next day, the Duke asked her and again received no answer. And the Duchess just cried and said she couldn't help him. These memories kept Adeline awake, and she kept wondering why Ray was like that. And she assumed that it was because of the incident with Wakon. Adeline couldn't sleep because she dreamed a lot about that day and wondered when this memory would stop causing her so many emotions. Our heroine asked herself over and over how long she would have to prove that she was useful to erase the memories of the past. Every night, lying in her bed and remembering the past, Adeline looked at her room, and every time she told herself with satisfaction that surely, now this is her room. The idea that this was not the small, miserable room she lived in comforted her, and now she lives in rooms worthy of a real duchess. And now, Adeline told herself, Ray doesn't interrogate her every night. The Duke doesn't bother her, Adeline thought, and therefore she should be happy. But for some reason, she didn't feel like it. Our heroine remembered her husband, and wondered why the night he didn't come she felt lonely. Sometimes, Adeline thought that she definitely hated and despised the Duke. But every sleepless night, standing on the balcony and looking into the distance, the Duchess thought about how wonderful it would be if her heart could forget Ray. Az and Wakon, who had been absent for 2 months, approached the Duke and looked surprised at the new building. And Astor, unable to resist, asked the captain if Adeline had told him what this building would be used for. Ray looked bewildered at the structure, not even imagining that something like this could be built on his estate in such a short time. And he did not know what to answer. And Astor, surprised, suggested that the answer could now be found. It came out faster than from Adeline herself. Wakon, thoughtfully, suggested that if this continues, they will eventually call Adeline captain, although she is already a captain, since she is married to a captain. And then Az, turning to his friend, asked him why there was so much praise suddenly. Direction of the Duchess. Then Astor and Wakon learned that this would be a new dormitory for the knights they would hire. And our heroine quickly approached them. Adeline smiled at the men and thought to herself that she had actually used magic to help complete it. But she would not tell anyone about it. Az was surprised and asked if this was really a hostel, since their order of knights was not that large as to need a hostel, to which the Duchess replied that in addition to the Devas, they would include mercenaries in their composition. Astor looked at the Duchess in astonishment and could not understand whether she was telling the truth or joking. Az turned to the captain and shouted what that meant, and Adeline, realizing, looked at her husband with fear. The Duke, after thinking for a moment, said that he did not remember being informed of such a thing. The heroine looked at her husband bewildered and said that this could not be and that she would not have made such an important decision randomly, since she clearly remembered that Mavin had given her permission, and immediately added that this was very strange. Ray looked simply dejected because he was almost on autopilot, and Adeline suggested calling the butler and ask him. The butler arrived, and the Duke asked him about permission to build a hostel and about the mercenaries, to which Mavin replied that when he arrived with a message from the Duchess about the Order of Knights, His Grace said to let the Duchess do whatever she wanted. Astor, trying to hold back laughter, turned to the captain and swallowing his letters. Since he could not speak correctly while laughing, he asked the Duke to leave with him for a minute. Ray looked confusedly at his wife and friends and realized that this time he had made a serious mistake in front of them. Wacken, turning to Adeline, asked her what she meant by an order of knights, because there would be mercenaries instead of ordinary knights, and if she knew how rude they were, and how difficult it was to deal with them. Our heroine replied that she knew all this, but how much longer were the three of them going to act? Adeline added that few devas remain, not to mention that most are in a state of rest, and it will take time to wake them up, and they also need to get information from the Asuras and wake up the devas. The Duchess examined the men and asked if this meant that Wakan and Oz should take turns, and that even if they recruited ordinary knights, how many of them could cross the forest of darkness? Astor looked at Adeline surprised and suggested that this is why they decided to recruit mercenary groups. And the Duchess, confirming her decision, replied that mercenaries were motivated by the lust for profit, and she did not think that this was particularly bad. Here our heroine took a deep breath and said that it even seems to her that we are similar to them, in the sense that to survive we become increasingly severe. Suddenly, the Duchess, laughing heartily, asked as to train the mercenaries properly, but Astor was very surprised by such an order, and immediately shouted why so suddenly. Taz tried to abandon this idea, assuring Adeline that he had never trained people, but the Duchess, encouraging him, assured him that everything was fine and that he could handle everything. And to herself, she thought that it was he who taught the mercenaries in her past life. Our heroine, approaching her husband and Wakan, and noticing the gleam in their eyes, which seemed to say, "What's up with them?" She asked bewildered what else. Suddenly, Adeline burst out laughing, so loudly and boisterously that everyone fell into a stupor, for they did not understand what had happened. After laughing, our heroine apologized and said that it was not her intention to laugh, but that both of them made puppy faces and she simply couldn't resist. Here, Astor and Wakan burst out laughing, and through their laughter they tried to tell each other that as a captain, he was like a puppy, and that such words would wake up even a demon queen who had passed away peacefully. Adeline, barely calm and wiping the tears that had sprung from her eyes from laughter, warned Wakana that she had another matter for him, and after thinking for a moment, said that she still needed to discuss something with Ray. The Duchess looked at all the men and noticed that it was good that they were all gathered here. To herself, our heroine thought that they would definitely think she was crazy, but she had no other choice. Looking into the eyes of her interlocutors, Adeline firmly announced that she would make a passage through the forest of darkness. Ray was simply stunned because he thought his wife did not know what she was saying. Wakan wanted to warn Adeline, telling her that the forest of darkness is not easy, to which the heroine replied that she realizes the importance of this forest. The Duke looked sadly at his wife and firmly forbade her to do so, saying that it was against. The Duchess affirmatively said that this was the expected answer, and looking him in the eyes, she emotionally asked him if he really thought that she would offer him such a thing without thinking. But our hero was adamant, specifically teaching that, even so, he still forbids her to decorate the mansion, plant a garden, even build new military training grounds, and create a new order of knights, since all this is unimportant, and that he, even she, will not be allowed to fulfill her last request. Adeline was surprised by her husband's statement, because she did not understand why he did not even allow it. But the heroine tried to remind him that she was a prophetess, and asked him if he really thought that she did not know that in the forest. In these lands, there were plants from the heavenly realms, but Ray sadly listened to his wife and asked her that, even knowing this, she was still planning to do something so ridiculous. The Duchess looked sternly at her husband and asked him how he could know if it was absurd, or not if he didn't even listen to her. Here our hero, under the emotional pressure of his wife, mumbled something like what he meant. But Adeline did not wait for excuses, and touchingly said that she would never do anything that could harm him and the Devas, and immediately asked him if he knew why. Our heroine looked into the distance at the training ground and began to say that this was her goal. But then she fell silent, as if gathering courage. After a short silence, the Duchess said that her goal was to fulfill all his wishes in 10 years, and that she would like to spend the rest of her life in these lands, in comfort and prosperity. The men looked at each other, wondering how she wanted to achieve everything in 10 years. If they expected to do it in 200 years. Adeline timidly said that this was possible for her, and immediately turned to Wakon, who quickly replied and said that he was ready to listen. Adeline, smiling mischievously, asked Wakon to start teaching her how to use a sword from that day on, since it seemed that she herself would have to protect her doubtful husband. The men looked at each other with even greater bewilderment, and Wakon asked if the captain would really be under Adeline's protection. Aster and Wakon covered their mouths with their hands, holding back laughter, since no one expected this from the Duchess. The Duke, looking threateningly at his friends, threatened to kill everyone if any of them laughed. But this had no effect, as Oaz and Wakon had trouble suppressing their laughter. Although they tried, Adeline, looking at the men, also smiled. She finally decided to stop this fun, and assumed that everyone had already laughed enough, and therefore it was necessary to move on to an important conversation. The Duchess asked to listen to her carefully, as she would tell them why she wanted to make a passage through the forest of darkness. And when the men paid her their full attention, Adeline said that in 10 years she would end this war. Adeline drew everyone's attention and said that first she would go to the Maven Island. Az was surprised by this decision of the Duchess, and, trying to clarify, began to argue that they were talking about the lands of darkness. And why suddenly Maven Island? Wakana was interested in how Adeline would personally go to the island, since it is too remote a place. It is impossible to teleport there, and the boat trip will take about a week. The Duchess said that she would go to the island herself and would also stop in Makran. At this point, the Duke expressed his bewilderment and asked her to explain her line of thought. His indignation was also expressed by Aster, who, due to his excitement, could not really express himself about this city. Adeline, smiling, helped Az in his statement, suggesting that Makran is a terrible city where all sorts of crimes happen. The men looked at our heroine with astonishment, who was not embarrassed and even smiled, and thought only one thing, that there was no way to refute her words. Adeline decided to explain her actions, saying that she had 3 serious reasons, for she said that she plans to make a path through the forest of darkness. But that's not all, since she knows what this forest means to the Devas. The Duchess revealed that the strange plants that populate the forest lands are actually divine plants. Seeing that they were listening to her, Adeline continued to say that because the plants that only live in the divine land took root in the Middle Earth, and began to look strange. After some hesitation, Adeline added that despite this, the amazing powers of the plants have not disappeared anywhere. The Duchess also said that the divine plants still protect the Duchy of Bensark. Continuing her story, our heroine said that if ordinary people set foot in these lands, they would be captured by the energy of the plants and go mad or die. Here, Adeline thoughtfully said that it is impossible to resist divine power, but it is possible to resist the incarnation of divine forces through the bodies of ordinary people. And that after the Great War, the Devas, who received a bad prediction, planted divine seeds in that land to increase strength after the loss of divine lands. The Duchess reported that the Devas did not want these lands to be open to everyone. Adeline conspiratorially fell silent and said that she could close or open the way there as she wished, and that it was also necessary to eliminate all those who wanted to awaken the Asura. Here our heroine laughed heartily and offered to organize a luxurious banquet. Because about 100 years have passed since you woke up Oz and Huacan, she turned to her husband, and she also recalled the name Horus, and the Duke confirmed her words with a nod of his head. The Duchess suddenly became thoughtful, and looking down, asked the men if they were not now waiting for an opportunity to penetrate those lands, and that she could meet the awakened Asuras with the help of those who penetrated there. And Adeline added with more confidence that the lives of those who returned from there would not be long. Our heroine, once again, looked at the men standing in front of her and explained that the reasons for going to Maven Island are precisely related to this. But she knows everything in theory, and if she wants to open the way, she must first obtain the materials. Ray looked closely at his wife and excitedly asked her if it was really necessary to do this, since there were enough materials here. But Adeline interrupted him, warning that if the question was only about materials, then she would have stayed, but there was something else. Everyone looked expectantly at the Duchess, but Adeline, looking at Az, suddenly burst into loud laughter and said that the food here was terrible. Aster, for his part, tried to justify himself, realizing that he had missed something. But the Duchess asked him not to worry, since she already understood everything when she looked at him. The Duke, also trying to explain everything, said that it was difficult here to personally select the servants, to which Adeline replied that while carrying out her plans, she would at the same time introduce them to a special cook who lived there. And the Duchess added that, moreover, the aforementioned person has a speedboat to get to the island. Ray, surprised by his wife's enthusiasm, thought about what he should do. Here Aster tried to reason with our heroine and asked her if she really had to go that far. Adeline looked at Oz with surprise and, confirming her intentions, said that she had already explained everything to everyone, and that, anyway, this was really not enough for them. But Aster did not give up, trying to dissuade the Duchess from the services of a mercenary from the famous city of Mokran, because you can borrow a boat elsewhere. Moreover, it is too dangerous. And what if it still turns out to be inadequate? But Adeline assured Oz that only after this would she have the courage to walk through the lands of darkness. And thinking, Adeline quietly said that she had a reason to board this particular high-speed boat. Aster continued to persuade the Duchess, telling her that it is difficult to understand now, but as soon as she leaves these lands, she will have to understand that there are only enemies around, and that Adeline is an important person to them. Our heroine was pleased to hear this, and immediately said that she also had a lot to do for them, as she had said before, and looking at the men who were listening to her words, Adeline said that she needed what they had, for which she would do her best. Our heroine thought that it would be good to stop there, since in any case they will try to benefit from each other. The Duchess looked at her husband and mentally asked him not to make that face, because if suddenly she became useless, everything would change again. Adeline kept thinking that this is how their relationship would continue, hoping that they would like her. And then her thoughts were interrupted by the loud voice of her husband, who asked her when she was leaving. Aster looked at the captain and could not contain his surprise. Ray explained that everyone had heard the reason, and if it was necessary to stop the Duchess. And if it was dangerous, then security could be assigned. Addressing his wife, our hero addressed her with an inappropriate word. The Duchess quickly replied, reminding him that her name was Adeline. The Duke, clicking his tongue, confirmed her words, pronouncing the name Adeline, to which the heroine calmly asked him not to make fun. Ray reluctantly agreed with his wife and told her that he would go with her, so don't worry. He will do what she wants. Adeline shouted in surprise and looked at her husband with amazement, as she did not expect such a turn of events. Our hero could not understand why Adeline had such a face, because he heard everything, and he wanted to know why she had such a reaction to his words, but the Duchess just asked him again, because she did not fully believe what she heard. Adeline, lowering her eyes, quietly said that she couldn't even think that he would say such a thing, and sincerely thanked her husband. Ray was embarrassed by her gratitude and mumbled that there was nothing to thank for, that she was the Duke's wife and could obviously do whatever she wanted. Even Iwa Khan, observing the family scene, looked at their captain and wondered if he could have changed. But our heroine was beset by other doubts, and she thought that she might have at least a little hope. At that moment, truly sinister events were unfolding in the dark castle behind thick walls. A red-haired girl sat on the bucket and looked inside, as if wanting to see something there. Around Hela, and it was her, on the floor were the skulls of various animals, the severed heads of roosters, and blood was splashed everywhere. She looked into the bucket and could not understand why the hell she could not see her future. The girl tried to recreate in her imagination the image of Duke Horace Benzark, as she remembered him, in order to look into his future. Then she tried to remember Duke's friend Asterlef and see his future, but failed. No longer expecting a miracle, Hela tried to remember and see the future of another friend of the Duke, Wekon Hein. Hela could not understand at what moment something had changed, since she was supposed to see his future. In her memories, the girl clearly saw how these three took her to the lands of darkness. She looked indignantly into the bucket, and, reflecting, said that she could not see through the blood of a rooster, nor through the blood of a sheep and a goat. She even used a pig. But not only the future, not even the present, was shown. Reasoning with herself, the girl kept thinking that she could see the future of others well. But then why didn't it work with them? Hela thought deeply, realizing that she had a problem, because then he would consider her useless. The memory haunted her day and night, and in it, Adeline asked Ray, "How do you know if it's ridiculous? Or not if you didn't even listen to me?" The next memory also haunted her, and in it, Adeline told the Duke that her goal was to fulfill all his wishes in 10 years, and that she would like to spend the rest of her life in these lands, in comfort and prosperity. Another memory arose in which Adeline, smiling mischievously, states that it seems she herself will have to defend her disbelieving husband. Memories followed one after another, and in the next memory, our heroine proudly presents herself to the Duke and introduces herself as Adeline Lutton. And another memory appeared, in which Adeline touchingly looks at her husband and says in a trembling voice that she couldn't even think that he could say such a thing to her. Duke Horace Bensark sat at his office desk, completely immersed in his memories, not understanding why he was thinking about Adeline so often. Our hero's thoughts were interrupted by a knock on the door, and Asterlef entered the office, who immediately noticed the captain's mood and offered to talk. The Duke, still not over his wife's memories, looked at his friend with a confused look, trying to understand what he wanted. Aster did not test the captain's patience for long, and directly asked him if it was really true that he was going with Adeline to Mokran. Our hero, with a look and a deep sigh, replied that yes, he was going with Adeline to Mokran, because she needed to go there. Oz tried to find out from his friend how it happened that he decided to accompany her, because Adeline is a valuable person to them, and she cannot get hurt, much less die. But still, you say you are taking her to that place. The Duke looked silently at Aster, not knowing how to stop this uncountable flow of questions, because he himself still could not understand the situation. Suddenly, Ray raised his head and asked Asta in a calm and thoughtful voice that he really looked like a weakling in the eyes of his subjects. The young man realized that he had gone too far in his statements and choosing his words. Since he no longer knew how to communicate precisely, he replied that this was not the problem. Aster expressed that the captain is stronger than anyone, and choosing his words, he tried to explain that fighting, and at the same time protecting someone, is a completely different matter. Our hero listened to a friend who asked the Duke if Mokran was considered a normal city, and immediately added that when aristocrats go there, they always hire a lot of guards. Aster, continuing his story, said that in the city, even if kidnappings occur, thefts, murders, or other crimes, but nothing becomes public, everything is kept silent. Here Oz added that it's not that he doesn't trust Adeline, but anything can happen. And if the captain really needs it, then let him go, but Adeline cannot go. The Duke listened to all of Oz's arguments and tried to oppose his friend, since he had already promised Adeline that they would go. So he did not want to refuse this trip. But Aster interrupted the captain, asking him since when the captain listened to others with such obedience, and that this was completely uncharacteristic of him. Az, looking directly into the Duke's eyes, told him what everyone knew, that the captain usually ignores everyone, and here he is going to a city with a terrible reputation just because the Duchess wishes so. The Duke thought about Az's words that, if you look at it this way, then this is why he follows Adeline's example. Why does he do everything as she wants? Ray pondered Astor's words about his behavior and tried to understand exactly when he started thinking that he had to do whatever she wanted. But he, the Duke thought, allowed the Duchess to do everything, from trivial demands, like home improvements, to the most ridiculous ones like this trip. Our hero could not understand himself, and why it happened that he started to think that he had to do all this. But in his imagination, Ray drew his wife more and more often. More and more often the image of Adeline, her blonde curls, arose in his mind, her slender figure, and the radiant gleam in her eyes. Our hero became very pensive, and noticed that some changes were happening to him that he could not explain. The Duke could not understand why. Looking into her eyes, his body seemed to stiffen, his voice became hoarse, and his memory tried to capture every past moment with Adeline. Realizing that these thoughts were almost driving him crazy, and not knowing how to deal with this, the Duke looked at Aster standing in his office and turned to him, expecting a friend's help, choosing the right words to better explain to Az, and still thinking about his decision. Ray asked his friend if he really looked strange. Aster was a little bewildered by this question, and scratching the back of his neck, said that it was very awkward for the captain to ask about this right now. The Duke lowered his head, realizing that his friend would not help him in any way, and Aster looked with great bewilderment at the thoughtful Duke, who agreed with him, and decided to drop this topic. But Az decided to ask his captain if the Duke would still go with Adeline. Despite his warnings about the negative reputation of the city of Mokran, Aster decided to share his observations with Ray, and said that he noticed that the captain was changing, and that there was nothing wrong with that so he did nothing. Deciding to leave the Duke's worries, Aster began to talk about the matter. He said that there are drawings and magic stones containing magic in the warehouse, and there are many of these stones there. So let the Duke process them into mana and take them, because it seems this will happen more and more often. Our hero sat at the table, and it seemed he did not understand at all what Az was talking about, and he interrupted him mid-sentence. Aster frowned and asked the captain, a little irritated, what else he wanted to ask this time. But the Duke, not paying attention to his friend's displeasure and looking him in the eyes, suddenly thanked him. Az was simply stunned by such an act from the captain and muttered in amazement that something incredible had happened, since the captain said thank you to me, but this had never happened before. Aster, already preparing to leave, suddenly smiled mischievously and mysteriously told Ray that he didn't know what Adeline had done to the Duke, but that it was very interesting, to which Ray said that Aster really believes that he will like all this, since he said that when saying goodbye, and with a sigh added that he would get as many magic stones as possible, and earn even more money, but he needed to put the mine in order. Our hero plunged back into his thoughts when he heard Aster's words upon leaving, in order to learn more about Adeline's magic, and the Duke agreed. Adeline stood in her coat and looked at the landscape spreading out the window. Catherine was nearby, wrapped in a shawl, and heard her mistress say that it was colder today. The maid suddenly thought that she had not followed correctly and that her mistress was freezing, and in a worried voice said that it was already December and the mistress needed to dress warmer. Our heroine burst into loud laughter and said that this coat suited her well and that she wasn't a bit cold. But she, on the contrary, was worried that Catherine was freezing. So the maid looked at her mistress in surprise and mumbled under her breath that she was fine. But Adeline, not paying attention to the girl's confusion, promised that she would buy a similar coat for Catherine later and send it to her, since she did not want her maid to freeze in the cold days. Wakan, who was gloomy and serious, and Maven, who cheerfully greeted Adeline and was very surprised that the Duchess was already ready, entered the hall. Adeline confirmed her readiness, to which the butler, in a mournful tone, said that he had just called Wakan to help him with the luggage, and added in a tragic voice that he himself could not carry it because he was weak. Wakan laughed mockingly, and calling Maven weak, recommended that he exercise more. To this remark, the butler asked, turning to Wakan, that he was simply thin. Adeline looked at the boys and knew for herself that the reason they were in a hurry this time was Maven, who, slightly offended, said that all ordinary people think the same about themselves. Adeline recalled that, indeed, in a past life, the reason for going to Maven Island was the danger of being attacked by evil spirits. Our heroine also remembered that it was a fact that the power of the Asuras becomes stronger due to the awakened spirits. And Adeline was very worried that if everything in this life is the same as in the past life, then one must be careful of the sirens that will awaken in 517, but they cannot wait until that time. Adeline understood that it was impossible to wait for the moment when the sirens would awaken, since Maven, who fell into a trap with Az, later died in battle with the sirens. Recalling all these moments and looking at the knight and the butler, the Duchess understood that this time they should act while the sirens were still asleep, and she loudly added so that Mawin would not worry, since she would take care of him. Wakan looked at Adeline in surprise, and then, casting a fleeting glance at Mavin, asked her if it was really her hobby to take care of and protect everyone. Reflecting on this situation, Wakan turned to the Duchess and told her that this time he would protect the captain, and this time he would take care of the butler. And Mavin immediately asked Adeline in an offended tone if she really thought he was so weak. Miwin looked at the Duchess confusedly and asked her not to be so weak as to take care of him. But he understands her, since the people around his master look like real monsters. But then Wakan interrupted him, saying that if anything happens, then let him hide without hesitation. But the butler loudly announced that he was already looking forward to the trip, and that he could no longer talk to Wakan. And taking off his suitcase, he added that he would go first. And Wakan, taking care of Mavin, muttered under his breath that he was offended. Again, Adeline, looking at the butler, turned to Wakan and suggested that he was not talking to Mevin like that out of malice, that he was just joking with him, and smiling mischievously, added that in truth, Wakan likes this type. Wakwin, surprised by this assumption, exclaimed angrily, denying the Duchess's assumptions. But Adeline reconfirmed her words and added that Wakwend would not regret it later. And again, in her memories, Adeline saw Maven's deathly pale face, on which drops of icy rain were dripping. The next memory that arose was the image of Wackwind leaning over Maven's corpse on the seashore, and thinking that it was necessary to do everything and better prevent this from happening again. Here, through a veil of memories, our heroine heard a question about the name of the mercenary she wants to meet this time, to which Adeline was surprised that she really hadn't said anything. The Duchess took a moment to answer, as she was debating whether to tell the whole truth or not, but once a decision was made, she said that this mercenary from the Eagle faction was called. Adeline mysteriously looked at the men present and said that this mercenary was Black Wind. Adelina looked at Wakan and Meven again and repeated once more that it was a mercenary from the Eagle faction, whose name was Black Wind. For some reason, Adeline looked specifically at Wakana, and she already knew that her confession would be followed by many tricky questions. And she was not mistaken. Wakan looked at the Duchess with some kind of reverent horror, and turning to her, he asked her if she knew what kind of person he was, and Adeline said in a calm voice that she knew very well about the mercenary and his reputation. But Wakan did not lag behind, thinking that Adeline had simply gone mad, and warned that if the Duchess knew about the mercenary, then she also knew that Black Wind mercilessly resells people. Adeline, still in a calm voice, confirmed that she knew all this, to which Wakan shouted in surprise that she, knowing all this, still wanted to bring that person. Our heroine, without turning around, said quietly, a little offended that apparently, sometimes Ray, as, and Wakan think of her as a little girl. Wakan became a little shy at such a confession from the Duchess, and a little ashamed. He said that he did not mean that, but that it could be very dangerous. Adeline instantly turned around, and looking directly into Wakan's eyes, she asked what would happen if it could be dangerous. Wakan looked at the angry Duchess bewildered, who, with her voice choked with emotion, and emphasizing every word, said that you are telling me to hide behind your backs every time, and that all my actions are dangerous. So what should I do now? Should I really give up everything? A little later, and having calmed down, Adeline, lowering her eyes, quietly said that, since prophecy is her strength, it is understandable that everyone is so worried. And then, after a short pause, she added that from everything she can draw exactly this conclusion, since everyone is worried about her, but she is not a doll who will act as told. Wakan looked at the Duchess with a look of amazement and realized that a strong personality stood in front of him, and the Duchess was revealing herself to him from another side. Adeline decided to clarify to Wakan that it was he who recently asked her if it was her hobby to take care of everyone, and Wakan confirmed that he really asked about it. Our heroine, then adding a little sarcasm to her voice, said that she must have seemed very small and weak in his eyes. And suddenly, looking closely at her hands, she quietly said that she didn't even believe she could wield a sword. But abruptly turning to Wakan, Adeline solemnly told him to remember that it was she who made this sword shine, which means that she also has the power to protect someone. After thinking for a moment, our heroine froze, as if remembering something, and said that thanks to someone she had already realized, that she should not just hide behind someone else's back. Adeline smiled cheerfully at Wakan and asked him to draw a conclusion from everything he heard. And he understood. And again a transition via teleportation, in which Adeline, without opening her eyes, flew into space. In a clearing among the trees, Adeline was greeted by Duke Horace Bensark, who, with a worried look, immediately asked her how she felt, and looking at her husband, the Duchess replied that she was fine, and that he was worrying in vain. The couple looked at each other in silence for a while, each thinking their own thoughts. Then Adeline, however, shared her thoughts that this time the transition via teleportation was not as difficult as the first time. And since this was the second time the Duchess used teleportation, it occurred to Adeline, and she shared it with her husband with a smile, that he should get used to these movements using teleportation, which means that she will use it more often. Suddenly, Adeline had the idea that since she can use magic, this means that she also has the power to protect someone. Wakan, who had just moved via teleportation, approached the spouses and, looking at the Duchess, he thought that it was not surprising that he was angry, because the Duchess was not an ordinary person, and common, but an obvious one. Wakan kept his distance from the spouses and wondered how it happened that he started to ignore Adeline, even though she hadn't done anything wrong to him. At that moment, Duke Horace Bensark told his wife that people considered the Devas and the Asuras were gods, but that in reality the gods existed separately. Continuing his story, the Duke said that those who accept the powers of the gods are seers. And he looked closely at his wife. Observing closely his wife's reaction to his story, Ray continued to say that seers are divine beings. Moreover, continuing the story, our hero said that the devas and asuras only use the magic of the tree of life. But seers can occasionally see the future through their dreams. While the Duke was telling his wife about the devas and asuras, Wakan thought about the Duchess and concluded that, in all probability, the Duchess uses teleportation so easily only because she is a seer. Standing in the distance and watching the couple, Wakan noted with satisfaction that he was glad Adeline married the captain. The couple, at that moment, were enjoying each other's company without paying attention to Wakana, who was watching them from afar, laughing quietly. Our hero looked at his wife, and it occurred to him that it was as if he was seeing her for the first time and getting to know her again. Ray looked at Adeline, noticing her beauty, the turn of her head, her smile, her figure, and gait, and mentally called her by her name, since he still had not dared to address her in that way. There was only one thought that came to the Duke's mind more and more often, that he was definitely crazy. And confirming this thought, Ray thought that he was even more convinced that he was definitely crazy when talking to Oz. And also that when it came to her, he turned into a complete fool. Our heroine ran forward, looking at everything around her, when suddenly the wind picked up a little. Adeline's ribbon in her hair untied, and, catching the airflow, tried to take the ribbon with it. Gray looked fascinated at his wife's face, shrouded in a halo of loose hair, and refuted the initial judgment about himself, suggesting that maybe he was a fool from the beginning, since even at that moment, he thinks about how beautiful she is. Here our hero heard how Wakwen admired Adeline's beauty, and the Duke, running forward, picked up the flying ribbon, at the same time considering himself pathetic for this act, and immediately wondered if everything was still like this. He managed with himself and his feelings, but then Adeline approached and sincerely thanked him. Adeline looked at her husband's worried face and the smiling expression on Wakwen's face as he looked at the Duke. And quietly, as if reasoning, she began to say that she was not sure. But then she stopped mid-sentence. But then, deciding that it was better to say it immediately, Adeline smiled timidly and said that because of teleportation, she might vomit. Our hero handed the ribbon to his wife, and Adeline thought that perhaps it was not necessary to admit such subtleties of her body. But then the misunderstanding would only increase. Our travelers continued on their way, and while passing through the forest, Wakan began to say that he had heard that orcs lived in the area. And at first it was a forest where monsters lived, so they sometimes attack people. Adeline turned around, and looking closely at Wakana, with a silent affirmation in her gaze, she said that this was true. Continuing his story, Wakant warned that compared to other cities, the situation here on the border is much more tense. Adeline listened with interest to Wakant, who, pointing his hand at the Duke, said that this is why they warned about the danger. Wakant expected the Duchess's reaction, as he was worried, but he was afraid that she would not like this concern. But Adeline expressed bewildered that this was so, and immediately, smiling, thought how clearly she saw what Wakant was thinking. The Duke, upon hearing Wakant, suggested that he was pressing for pity and could pretend that he was also listening to him, but he immediately dismissed this idea. But then Adeline thanked Wakant for his concern and added that he had warned her and ordered her to hide behind him or the Duke in case of danger. Ray looked at his wife and thoughtfully wondered if Adeline really liked worrying about her. This was something new for him, so our travelers kept walking. The Duke was more serious than ever, and soon Bakan exclaimed that while chatting, they had already arrived. And turning to the Duchess, he told her that they had arrived and in front of her was the city of Macron. Adeline looked at the city walls and suddenly became interested in entering quickly and looking at the city from the inside. But at the same time, she felt some kind of anxiety. Upon entering the city, our companions immediately heard noises and shouts of voices coming from everywhere. Merchants shouted from different sides and in different ways, offering their goods and their services, declaring that only they had the best quality. Ray and Wakan were cautious, as they were alert, but they also looked around with interest. But Adeline was very surprised by everything she saw and said that she did not expect this, and that there were so many resellers in the city. The Duke, calmly shrugging his shoulders, said casually that a city is always like a city where there is a large number of tourists. But there are also many mercenaries in the city. Here, Adeline turned sharply to her husband and tensely asked him why, if there were so many tourists in the city. He did not allow her to come here. Ray, with his head bowed, quietly said that he agreed with this trip, to which Adeline happily exclaimed that she was very happy and very grateful to him for it. Moreover, our heroine thought that, since she remembered the past, perhaps she would have a chance to clarify some nuances with Ray. And the Duchess said that she knew that many mercenaries lived in the city, but a large number of tourists was a complete surprise. For her, our hero was not surprised by his wife's interest, but easily explained that in the city the taxes are low, so rare goods can be bought at an affordable price, and people gladly take advantage of it. The Duke also said that there are many stadiums and gambling houses in the city as well, and many people come to see it, but this information greatly interested our heroine. Adeline looked at her husband, who was speaking with interest and excitement about the city, and thought that her husband was already tired of explaining. But Ray looked into his wife's interested eyes and continued to talk about the city, its inhabitants, and their morals. Here, our travelers heard a new announcement that a tournament of the strongest would take place, and a real hell beast was acting in the arena. And then flyers with the announcement of the tournament began to fly from all sides. Our hero, taking one of the flyers with the announcement and reading it, said that there is another reason why the streets are so noisy. Vaken, who had been walking silently all this time and did not interfere with the spouse's communication, agreed that at that time there was always noise in Makran because of this. And he turned to the Duchess, trying to clarify that this was the first time he had seen something like this. And pieces of paper with advertising information flew all over the square. People grabbed and read the announcement aloud, so the noise in the square was unimaginable. Unimaginable. Adeline also took a flyer with an announcement about the tournament and began to look at it with interest. Reading the information, the flyer said that Makran's attraction was the opening of the season, that there would be a competition, and that one of the participants was a hell fighter. Our heroine looked at the whole announcement, but still reread the information on the sheet several times, and quietly said that it would be tomorrow. Adeline already knew from a past life that such competitions are held in tournament format, and people also bet money on the winner, and if the bet works, then they can win money. And if the bet is large, the winnings will not be small at all. So it occurred to our heroine that, as a person who knows the past, she can try to make a bet without taking risks, because she knows who will win this game. Adeline remembered from a past life how the captain of the Eagle faction said in his conversation that a hell fighter would make many stupid mistakes and would lose. The Duchess also remembered the captain's words, that people complained that it was a competition where the organizers earned money from the spectators. Our heroine unconsciously called her husband, and Ray, seeing her worried state, leaned towards her face and asked what was wrong with her. Then Adeline seemed to wake up from her heavy thoughts, and smiling, made a proposal to her husband. Why not earn some money today, if there is such an opportunity? Wakan looked at the Duchess with interest, and asked her in surprise that she had really seen the fights, and with a worried look, added that it would be a very tough fight. Adeline smiled and said that everything was in order. Moreover, after their arrival at the duchy, Duke Bensark did not stop spending money. For the garden was decorated, a building for the knights was constructed, and the interior was changed. The Duchess firmly said that this time she was going to earn some money, but Wakwent decided to consult with the Duchess and asked her if she would really make a bet. Bakan decided to show off his skills and proudly announced that he is a good judge of people, and as soon as he looks at a person, he immediately understands whether he will win or not. So if the Duchess does not know which participant to bet on, go ahead, then let her ask him. Here Huacuant looked at the Duchess bewildered, who looked at him calmly and even condescendingly, and interrupted his pretentious speech by reminding him that a seer stood in front of him. Adeline smiled cheerfully, and Huacuant said with shame that he was thinking and would choose the same as her. And only the Duke remained thoughtful and did not share the excitement that captivated his wife and friend. The Duchess, noticing that her husband was standing with a serious look, turned to him and asked him if he could participate and make bets. Our hero was still there, lost in his thoughts, and even when Adeline repeated her question, he only looked at her distractedly, not knowing what to answer. Having mastered his confusion and pretending not to understand what was being said, the Duke cleared his throat and asked what the stakes were. Adeline and Wakwent looked at the Duke in astonishment, trying to understand if he was joking or telling the truth. Wakwent looked at his captain and realizing that he was not joking, said bewilderedly that the Duke lived for 500 years and really does not know what bets are, but this is simply incredible. Our hero, looking sadly at Wakana and his wife, said that he had no time for useless things. Here Wakant began, gesturing emotionally, to rant about how betting is not a useless affair, but something like a life or death battle. But the Duke sarcastically asked his friend how one can gamble on something where the participants really have powers that appear out of nowhere. To which Wakan justified himself by explaining to the captain that he described the tournament like a novel, or something like that. Adeline looked thoughtfully at her husband and wondered why he had that expression on his face, as if he were sad or if she was still mistaken. And our hero, indignant, reprimanded his friend that with such strength it is better to do the work effectively and not play tournaments or make bets. Wakwin tried to explain to the Duke that these fights are very popular and that the bets people make are captivating. That is like gambling. Then Baikan said that if everything happens tomorrow, then the information about the fighters must already be published on the board, and they only need to choose which participant to bet on and deposit money. Ray also began to talk about betting and said that for popular fighters, the coefficient decreases, and for strangers, on the contrary, the coefficient increases. Suddenly, as if he had an idea, the Duke stared intently at the Duchess, and turning to her, suggested that she must have another reason to earn money. Adeline laughed and told her husband that he really was a captain, since he was very ingenious. And remembering the recent expression on her husband's face, she thought that in a past life he also had such a warm expression. Suddenly, the Duke's mood changed drastically, and Ray began to tap Adeline's forehead with his finger, angrily saying that it was very commendable that she noticed her husband's insight, but that she still shouldn't get carried away by gambling because they already have a lot of money. Adeline's indignation knew no bounds, since her husband allowed himself such an outrageous act towards her, because he hit her forehead, and Wakwint was also quite surprised by how the Duke acted, and what he said to the Duchess. Ray looked angrily at his wife and friend. Suddenly he calmed down, and said that there was a man named Palan who really loved to fight, but he went bankrupt, so he had to help him. But as soon as Palan received the money, he immediately spent it on gambling. The Duke looked at his wife and friend, and added that in those distant times there were also people who gambled and made bets. Here our hero leaned towards his wife and said with a slight smile that if she wanted to experience excitement, he should work hard so that the Duchess would never starve. Adeline was confused by such a confession from her husband and, embarrassed, lowered her eyes. She apologized and quietly said that this would not happen. Ray Wakan looked at the embarrassed Duchess, who stood without lifting her head and kept muttering something. Wakan looked at the Duke and thought that this was the first time the captain had spoken about his past. And this was a special event, since even when his friends asked him, he said nothing. Suddenly, our heroine raised her head and, straightening her shoulders, told her husband not to treat her like a little girl, to which the Duke condescendingly looked at his wife and agreed with her. Wakwin wondered if the captain really wanted to talk about the past only while looking at Adeline, and he noted with pleasure that it was interesting to see him like this. And the Duke, at that moment, looked around and thought to himself that not like this strange atmosphere. Here Wakwin, to stop talking about games and bets, exclaimed enthusiastically that he first needed to go to the room, because he had worked hard to find it. The Duke silently nodded at the message from his subordinate and friend, and the Duchess expressed her gratitude, saying that it was wonderful of him that he had taken care of the housing in advance, to which Wakwint replied that he could not allow Adeline to sleep anywhere. Place here Wakwint smiled maliciously at the Duchess and said that even if she could sleep anywhere, the captain would be very angry. Adeline burst into laughter at Wakan's words and asked where to go. The hotel receptionist greeted our travelers at the entrance, exclaiming with joy that our guests, who had booked a royal room for couples and a luxury suite, had finally arrived. Adeline looked at the hotel lobby with interest, not paying attention to the receptionist's words, and thought that this was actually a normal, everyday hotel, and besides, a royal room had been booked. Our heroine, looking around, imagined a room that only aristocrats could afford, and she was glad that this room could now be hers. Then, the words just uttered by the receptionist reached our heroine's consciousness, and turning sharply and looking at her, she thought that she really had spoken about the room for couples. Adeline immediately, interrupting the enthusiastic exclamations of the receptionist, again asked her to make sure that, according to her, one room was royal, and the other was a suite. The receptionist, not ceasing to enthusiastically praise the hotel, confirmed the Duchess's words that a royal room for couples had been booked, and a suite, and continued to describe the room, saying that the royal room had a huge bathtub, and that the lady could have a good rest. Adeline turned bewildered, and turned to Wakhan with a silent question in her eyes. Is this really so? And did he order these rooms? To which Wakhan cheerfully said that it was true, and that the couple would enjoy it. Wakhan smiled satisfied, saying that it was great, and Adeline at that moment thought that this was impossible, since Wakhan did not understand at all. Adeline turned to her husband and asked if they would really use the same room, and immediately wanted to offer him something, but stopped mid-sentence. The Duke suggested that since they were married, it would not be strange for them to use different rooms. But our heroine remembered that in her previous life, her husband hated this terribly. In Adeline's memories of her past life, it shone through that she had never seen Ray share a room with anyone. He didn't even share a room with her, who was technically his wife for 25 years. The Duchess, remembering his past behavior, tried to convince her husband, suggesting that he also felt uncomfortable. Adeline looked at her husband and realized that now he would ask her about such an assumption and insist on an answer, and she thought about how to explain her words. The Duke looked at his wife in surprise and decided to ask her why she thought he would feel uncomfortable. Thoughts mixed in our heroine's head, and looking at her husband, she did not know what words to choose to explain everything. Our hero, embarrassed by this assumption from his wife, a little bewildered, he approached Adeline and sincerely asked her if she really didn't like sharing a room with him. The girl, remembering her husband's behavior in a past life, began to calm down and adapt not to ask Ray now what he meant. Adeline mentally convinced herself not to repeat the same stupidity, so as not to fall in love with him again for his sweet words. Since in her past life, everything ended tragically, and she could not forget the moment she was killed, the heroine still reminded herself that she had already come very far, and that she simply needed to concentrate on protecting her place, and not to hurt herself again. The Duchess, feeling the mocking gaze of the receptionist, looked at her husband, who was still waiting for an answer, and looking at her demandingly. Adeline lowered her head and said that since it was already booked, nothing could be done, and she would have to share a room between two. The Duchess immediately turned to the receptionist and demanded that she show her the room quickly. Otherwise, her legs hurt unbearably, and she wanted to rest. The heroine, tired, followed the receptionist to her room because she no longer had the strength to argue and talk, and she was very tired. Our hero looked after his departing wife and told himself, turning mentally to her, that everything was fine and that he would do whatever she wanted, just as he had promised. The receptionist, with a pointing gesture, pointed to the room door and said with a smile of satisfaction that this is your royal room for couples. Our heroine stopped confusedly in front of the door upon hearing that this was not just a royal room, but a room for couples, and she looked at her husband, who was next to her. But her husband was absolutely serene. Upon looking at the room, Adeline realized with joyful satisfaction that there would be a separate room for her, a separate room for Ray, and a common living room. So the Duchess thought about it and concluded that this is why her husband was so calm. Adeline laughed slightly and thought that she was worried in vain about meeting her husband at night, and quietly said that it was a relief. But the Duke still heard his wife and was clearly discouraged by her words. The Duke, however, did not focus on these words and called his wife, asking her to come to him for a minute before going to her room. Our heroine, already preparing to go to her room, turned to her husband and, a little surprised, asked him what was wrong. Adeline looked at her husband with such commotion, and there was such childlike confidence in her gaze that Ray involuntarily fell in love with her. The Duke took his wife with him and led her to the balcony, showing the view that opened up around them, and at the same time looked at her, waiting for a reaction to what he saw. Adeline ran delighted to the edge of the balcony, looked at the impressive view of the city, the roofs of the houses, the lines of the streets stretching out, the people walking, and exclaimed with admiration how wonderful it was, because all of Macron was in the palm of your hand. Our hero looked at his wife, how she rejoiced like a child, how she applauded, how enthusiastically she admired what she saw, and decided to ask her if she liked it. And our heroine, still in the same state of admiration, turned to her husband and excitedly told him that she liked it very much. To this, the Duke modestly replied to his wife that he was very happy to be able to please her. Looking at his wife, our hero understood that an unknown feeling was happening to him. that he had never felt before. But with this feeling, he wants to keep seeing someone smile, or rather, his wife's smile. Ray looked at Adeline, noticing the beauty of her eyes, her hair, her head tilt, her gestures, and he realized that he liked looking at her and liked the feeling that arose in him. At that moment, elsewhere in the tavern, a man was sitting at a table and drinking beer. On the table there was a sword and a medallion with an eagle painted on it. And soon, a young man in a dark cloak entered the hall, whom the man sitting at the table was waiting for. A young man approached the table and, without removing his hood, greeted the man, calling him captain. And in response to this greeting, the man turned to the boy, calling him Coquin. Coquin told the man that during lunch he saw interesting people, and that it was about a girl dressed in men's clothes, a nobleman and a guard. The captain, listening to his subordinate, asked why these people were interesting. Continuing his report, Coquin said that the newcomers rented a royal room at the Majo Hotel. And this is simply unthinkable, since during the fight season it is simply impossible to book this room. The man at the table, whom Coquin called captain, fell silent. He reflected on the information he had heard, and then asked with interest if they really had that much money. Suddenly, the captain, hitting the table with his fist, muttered that he hated being bored, and angrily added that he would bring the girl when she was alone. Then they could touch some money, to which Coquin smiled and said that now he would prepare everything. Meanwhile, our heroes were walking through the city, and Adeline was happily looking at the streets and the shop windows. She ran into them and called her companions to follow her. In the next shop, when some tired men were waiting for Adeline, who was looking at lace dresses, the Duchess said, with admiration, that this area turns out to be famous for lace, and immediately addressed the shop owner that everything in Madame's products was so beautifully decorated, to which the owner warmly and smilingly replied. She replied that the lady was even sweeter. Wackant watched how the Duchess rejoiced at everything she saw and whispered quietly to the Duke that if they hadn't come here, Adeline would have been offended by them all her life, to which the Duke only nodded his head. Since, admiring his wife, he simply could not utter a word. Remembering his duties, Wackant turned to Adeline and asked her how long they would stay here, since he needed to inform her to prepare a carriage to the capital in advance. Adeline turned to Wakan and told him that 3 days were enough, and she thought she could have stayed longer, but that it was much more important to get to Mavin Island. And if there are mercenaries from the Eagle faction here, tomorrow, as soon as possible, when they smell money, they will contact immediately. Wakan waved his hand and shouted that he had gone to the communication hall, and that he had gone to fulfill his duties, wishing the spouses to look around for now. Adeline, shouting after the young man, sincerely thanked Wakana for his help, to which the young man replied that he was always happy to help. Following Wakana with her gaze, our heroine looked at her husband and suggested they continue shopping. The Duke silently took all the shopping bags and followed his wife. And Adeline, walking in front, told herself that she didn't believe Ray would still do everything without saying a word to her. After a while, our heroine, approaching the Duke, apologizing, invited him to hand over the packages that Wakan had previously carried. Explaining that it was difficult for him, Ray looked at his wife bewildered, thinking to himself that how could she even offer to give him the bags to carry them herself. And in response to the Duchess's proposal, our hero replied that she should not take the packages, that he would carry them himself, and thought that the Duchess still had something to see. Adeline tried to object to her husband, but fell silent. Our heroine looked at her husband with a large number of packages and thought about how to deal with this situation. And then an idea occurred to her. How could they go shopping if Ray was so busy? And again, she turned to her husband. Adeline, smiling at her husband, decided to make him a new proposal, telling him that he must be tired, and that perhaps it would be better if he took the packages to the room and came back. And then the two of them would have tea while she went shopping. Here, the Duke looked quizzically at his wife, but decided to find out if she could manage alone. Our heroine assured her husband that she would take care of everything so that he would return soon, and smiling, added that sometimes women go shopping alone. Our hero smiled at his wife's last comment and, saying that he would be back soon. When to take the packages, Adeline, saying goodbye to her husband, said that she would be waiting for him. Our heroine looked after her departing husband, but thought to herself that there was still no one, that she needed to check something, and went into the fitting room. Adeline took some things to the fitting room to show them, opened her purse, mentally prepared herself, and made sure that everything should turn out well for her. At that moment, our hero was walking towards the hotel, and suddenly felt that an unpleasant feeling, as if someone was watching him, invaded him. Ray, to check his feelings, turned towards an alley, saw out of the corner of his eye a guy peeking around the corner, and realized that his premonition had not deceived him, and that he was really being watched. The young man who followed our hero was very surprised that the Duke, whom he followed, turned towards an alley and very quickly began to move away. Trying not to lose sight of the Duke, the guy jumped around the corner and followed the trail, speeding up his steps, indignant that if he missed the Duke, he would be lost. Suddenly, the Duke disappeared from the young man's sight, and he ran faster when suddenly he felt someone grab him. The Duke grabbed and twisted his pursuer, not giving him a chance to breathe, but the guy only tried to gasp about what he was doing. Ray, lifting the boy by the chest and looking him in the eyes, asked him why he was looking at him, to which the young man only gasped and writhed to get rid of the hands strangling him. Then, the boy saw the sword in our hero's hands and with an intermittent voice tried to say something, but he could not fully express his thought. The Duke, continuing to strangle the guy, angrily said that depending on his answer, he would decide whether to kill him or save his life. But suddenly, he thought to himself that this guy hadn't come to kill. Then, looking into the eyes of the guy who was already gasping in his hands, our hero thought that the guy really just wanted to rob him. Ray pushed the boy away and watched him gasp for breath, clutching his throat, and threateningly said that it was better for him not to appear in front of him again. By chance, out of the corner of his eye, the Duke noticed something shining on the ground and saw a medallion. Our hero picked up the medallion from the ground and began to examine it with interest. But up close, the Duke thought about it, because the sign he saw on the medallion was vaguely familiar to him, and he tried to remember what this sign meant and where he could have seen such a medallion. Then our hero had an idea and remembered that the sign on the medallion belonged to the Eagle mercenary clan, and immediately thought bewilderedly, why would they pursue him? Adeline was still in the fitting room and happily looked at her bag, from which a fantastic light emanated, and excitedly said that she had succeeded. Looking at the bright glow, Adeline thought that the magic she practiced was the magic of the unlimited, and now she saw ordinary space magic that expands a limited space. The Duchess remembered hearing that since space magic is very ancient, it is very difficult to use. Our heroine looked out the window at the setting sun rays, and it came to mind that Ray had also reacted to her ability to use magic in the past. Obviously, the Duchess thought that she had a special gift. Our heroine smiled at her own thoughts and said that, to be honest, she really likes using magic. Then, Adeline realized that her husband had been gone for a long time, and when he would return she worried, although she had recently asked the shop owner to inform her about the Duke's arrival. Just thinking that perhaps she might miss her husband, someone knocked on the door, and a voice from behind the door said that drinks had been brought to her. Adeline was very surprised by this message, as she was not expecting anyone other than her husband, and she did not order any drinks. The Duchess thought that this was very strange, as she was about to order drinks when her husband arrived, and she began to say that she hadn't ordered anything yet. Adeline's speech was suddenly interrupted when the door burst open, and a young man burst into the room. A young man burst into the room, ran to Adeline and put a handkerchief with a specific smell to her face. Gasping, our heroine still tried to look at the man who attacked her, and it seemed to her that she recognized Kokina from the Eagle mercenary clan in this man. While struggling with the young man and trying to get rid of the bad smell, the heroine thought that while her husband was away, she did not expect to encounter mercenaries from the Eagle faction clan like this. Looking into her attacker's eyes, Adeline already knew for sure that she had been attacked by Coquin, who is the deputy head of the Eagle mercenary clan, and that in a past life, Coquin was one of her people. Our heroine remembered this boy who supported her, and how he told her that he did not understand why she tolerated everything when she was treated, and that the Duchess was Madame Adeline and not that woman. Adeline remembered how Coquin looked at her, and touchingly said that he was always on her side. Our heroine suddenly realized that obviously, there were still people who cared about her, and she had to find them. Weak since the forces were still unequal, and enduring with all her might, Adeline understood that she had to find everyone devoted to her because she could save them. Suddenly, Wackwant's words flashed through the Duchess's head, asking if her hobby was protecting others. Adeline looked at Coquin, remembered and thought, why should she protect others if these people are much stronger than her? Our heroine could no longer resist the attacker's strength. Her hand hung limply, and in her head, she wondered why she had forgotten all this. The last flash in Adeline's mind was the same question about why she forgot everything, why she forgot about her past life. It occurred to our heroine a vision that after the Great War, the Devas were again defeated. In Adeline's mind came the names of the people who stood by her in a past life. Wakan, as Maven, Coquin, Avid, and all died. From somewhere came the understanding that at the moment, the sword pierced his heart. There was no one left on her husband's side, Duke Horace Bensark. At that moment, Wakant, walking through the city since he did not want to disturb the spouses, met our hero on the street, and both were incredibly surprised, since they did not expect to see each other. Wakant was eating a shish kebab while walking and trying to chew the meat faster. He asked the Duke in surprise why he was there. Wakant, realizing that Ray should now be with the Duchess somewhere else, asked the Duke bewilderedly if he was not with Adeline. Our hero thought about the best way to explain to Wakana why he was here, and not with his wife, and decided to tell it as it is. The Duke said that Adeline sent him to the hotel to take his purchases, since it was not very convenient to continue shopping with a large number of packages. And then, Wakwin choked and started clearing his throat. While coughing, Wakwin tried to hide his laughter, but he was not doing a good job. Wakin said through laughter that our captain had become so sweet after his marriage, and that Ray had nodules on his cheekbones, but he listened silently and only thought angrily that he should have crossed paths with him. Wakin kept laughing and thinking about his captain's behavior, who unintentionally felt very ashamed, since Wakin saw his weak spot, and imagining the spouses together, Wakin laughed again and concluded privately that Adeline was simply incredible, since in such a short time, visible changes had occurred in the Duke. Wakin, who had already laughed, cleared his throat and finished his kebab. He began to look around and asked the Duke where the Duchess herself was, if she was really waiting somewhere nearby. Ray, carelessly shrugging his shoulders, and even with a bit of indifference, replied that Adeline said she would stay and continue shopping, and that she would wait for him. Vacant was silent for a while, digesting what the captain was telling him, and then with alarm in his voice said that if the Duchess sent her husband to the hotel, it means she is alone somewhere now. Hearing Wakant, the Duke only now realized that he had acted very recklessly, and in vain he let himself be convinced by his wife's persuasion. Vacant, without shame, began to be indignant and to scold the captain that this is Makran. This is a city where you don't know what will happen in 5 minutes. The young man still could not calm down and looked into the Duke's eyes, as if explaining to a small child that in this city even adult men move only with guards, and how the captain could leave Adeline alone. Our hero, realizing the truth of his friend's words, turned around sharply and walked quickly towards the shop where he had left his wife, while Wakan shouted after the captain to wait for him. The Duke walked quickly and did not turn at his friend's voice, but repeated to himself that how could he forget about everything. Ray remembered how happily Adeline smiled, saying that when he returned they would have tea together. And he thought to himself that it was because of that smile that he lost his mind, and was ready to fulfill all her whims, calling himself a fool and thinking what was so good about her offering to have tea. Our hero, turning to a stranger, asked him not to let anything bad happen to her. Then, cursing himself for all he was worth, the Duke, along with Wakant, ran to the shop, and immediately addressed the seller with a question about the girl who was supposed to be waiting for him. But the seller stood in front of him, our companions with an inscrutable face, and said that he did not understand what the gentleman was saying, since they did not have such a guest. Wakant, trying to help the seller remember, told him to think carefully, because she was a beautiful girl with white hair and purple eyes. But the young seller at first pretended to remember him, but then, without looking up, as if reasoning and turning towards the king, said so that the Lord would think if he knew how many people disappeared nearby. The seller was already starting to get annoyed, looking at the annoying men, but patiently said how could he remember everyone, and that maybe the girl just went for a walk. As he was about to leave, the seller finally said that he did not remember the lady with white hair, dressed in men's clothes. Suddenly, the seller coughed, choking, as someone strongly grabbed his throat, and it was Duke Horace Bensark. Our hero held the seller tightly, squeezing his throat and threateningly, pronouncing every word clearly. He asked the seller how he knew that the girl was dressed in men's clothes, because they didn't tell him. The seller gasped. Sweat ran down his face. Tears welled up in his eyes, and through the noise in his ears, he heard how the Duke reprimanded him that if he knew something, it was better to tell him quickly. Ray understood that his wife's life was now at stake, so he warned the seller, with a threat in his voice, that he must tell everything if he did not want to die here and now. The Duke kept the seller at a distance, and without ceasing to squeeze his throat, he asked for one. And again to tell him everything he knew, if he didn't want to die right now. The seller, with his legs dangling in the air, gasped, groaned, and could not utter a single word. Blood pounded in Ray's head, and it was as if he heard Wacken's voice from afar, shouting at the captain to stop, since he might kill the seller, and if he kills him, they will not be able to find Adeline. Our hero seemed to have woken up from a bad dream, and cursing, let go of the seller, throwing him to the ground, who, curled up, tried to catch his breath. Wacken began to bother the seller, trying to reason with him, but he kept clearing his throat, inhaling deeply, and could not recover. But then Wacken decided to change tactics, and smiling sweetly, told him that if he did not tell the whole truth, then there was a possibility that he would disappear, and people here tend to disappear. The seller looked at Wacken with a more meaningful look, and realizing that they were repeating his words that many people were disappearing in the area. He thought about what to tell him. The seller looked at the angry and threatening faces of the people in front of him. Tears welled up in his eyes in fear, and horror gripped his heart. Wacken shook the seller again. He pressed him against the wall and asked. Now he remembered the girl who was here. Dree saw how Wacken shook the seller and suddenly heard the latter, in an intermittent voice, say that the girl was carried away by the black wind. Our hero looked at the seller with sadness, and his thoughts rushed, one more terrible than the other. But the main question hung in the air. What to do now, and how to find Adeline? At that moment, our heroine, through the darkness of her unconscious state, heard a voice saying that he had warned him not to be rude to her. But no, it was necessary to make her lose consciousness, vaguely seeing two men in front of her, one of whom exclaimed that she had finally regained consciousness. Adeline tried to concentrate, opened her eyes, and tried to look around. Our heroine, bowing her head, which was simply splitting from what had happened, tried to find out where she had been taken and what kind of place it was. Here memories appeared in our heroine's memory, but they were some kind of separate images, and incoherent, and Adeline tried to restore these memories in her memory, but it didn't work. Adeline, even in such a terrible state, came to the conclusion that these memories were associated with the past, and keeping this in mind, she tried to reason that now the Devas were obviously stronger. At least they were not so weakened as to die in an instant. Our heroine's thoughts rushed into the past, and although she didn't believe it, a worm of doubt got into her head that the Usuras had really awakened. Sitting on a chair in front of the men, Adeline, trying to calm down and thus preparing for the positive, mentally said that the fall of the Devas was still far away. Adeline lowered her head, as the pain did not stop, and she also felt a little nauseous. And looking at the tips of her shoes, after thinking for a while, she thought that maybe she could do it, and she could change everything. Our heroine, upon hearing male voices, realized that they were addressing her, since they affirmatively said that she had regained consciousness and should answer questions. Adeline took a deep breath and thought that she would deal with this situation first, and smiling, and adding confidence to her voice, she already said out loud that she herself still wanted to meet with them. So by bringing her here, they reduced their problems. The Duchess stared at one of the men, and greeting him, said that she was delighted to meet him, and called him Abid. Abid looked at our heroine in astonishment, and while drawing his sword from its scabbard, he slowly said that he was not familiar with her face. Carefully looking at the girl's face, Captain Abid placed the tip of his sword on her throat, and asked her how she knew his past name. With a slight movement of her hand, Adeline took the sword away from him and said quietly that she would regret killing him. Abid thought about it, but did not take the sword away from the girl, and then, smiling, said that she was funny. Without changing position, and still threatening our heroine, Abid angrily said that the lady knew how many times he had heard this expression while dealing with aristocrats. Adeline calmly looked at Captain Abid and asked if she really should know this, and, in any case, his goal is money, and immediately suggested not wasting time. Abid, ironically, continuing the conversation, asked the girl why she was so sure that his goal was only money. Maybe she was mistaken. The Duchess laughed and began to explain that it was very simple if you thought about it a little, and she was ready to talk about her reasoning. And as if thinking, but at the same time observing the reaction of the men, Adeline explained that she was staying in the best hotel in the city, where even aristocrats find it difficult to rent a room, and this should already be of interest to him. Continuing her conclusions, the Duchess explained to the men that what they saw next was a girl walking completely alone, and without security, and this was generally an ideal opportunity for kidnapping. Just a gift from fate. Abed, agreeing with her explanations and remembering her words, asked that if she herself wanted to meet with them. Then, what did she want to tell him at the meeting? Here, Adeline lowered her head and said embarrassed that she was talking about kidnapping people while walking. But some people did not take security without a second thought. Without looking anywhere, our heroine, continuing her story, added that, however, these people can be so strong that they simply do not need protection. Suddenly, an incomprehensible uproar was heard behind the door, and Adeline's speech was interrupted by Coquin. Turning to the captain, and Abed, turning sharply, exclaimed, trying to understand what those sounds were. Those present in the room heard sounds of beating and fighting, the noise of footsteps moving away, and loud shouts that there were some monsters outside. Coquin, not knowing what to do, first ran to the door. Then he turned around and exclaimed to Captain Abed, offering to accompany him. Then the door burst open with a roar and hue Khan, and the Duke entered the room, who, looking threateningly at Coquin and Abed, said sadly what he should do if the Duchess escaped alone. Captain Abed, frowning and raising both hands in defeat, murmured to Adeline that he kept wondering why she was so self-confident. Abed, turning to the astonished Duchess, continued to say that it turns out she had every reason to feel safe. But our heroine did not listen to Abed because she was trying to understand what was happening, and it was as if from afar she heard Wakin's alarmed voice, asking if everything was okay with her. But the Duchess, frozen like a statue, thought that even she did not expect this, since she was just going to negotiate with the mercenaries and give them what they wanted after I said she was the wife of the Duke of Darkness. Adeline looked at her husband without stopping, and finally calmed down and regained her senses. The Duchess turned to the Duke, asking how they both knew that she was here, because even she did not know her exact location. Wakin was already relieved, and even somehow cheerfully said that he wouldn't even ask, since it was his Captain Ray who did everything. Wakin began his story with how he and Captain Ray remembered what and who Adeline talked about before traveling to the city of Makran, and the name Black Wind appeared in memory, which belongs to the Eagle clan, and that she wanted to hire him. Wakin told how they talked about finding the clan, how he warned the Duke that they could not simply go and destroy the entire clan, and how they thought about what they should do in such a situation. From the moment he realized that Adeline had disappeared, Wakan said, Captain Ray thought every minute about what he could do and decided that he needed to use magic. Wakan said that, having heard such a decision from the captain, he wanted to oppose this idea. He tried to stop the captain because this cannot be done since it is magical. Wakan said that he tried to reason with his captain, exclaiming that if he used magic, Captain Usura could immediately discover his whereabouts. Trying to prevent the captain from committing a reckless act, Wakan told the Duchess. He tried to explain that the Duke would be in danger if Captain Usura found him. And then Wakan quietly told the Duchess, continuing his story, that the Duke looked at him with a dull expression, and sighing deeply, said that he didn't care. Here Bakan, pleased with himself, smiled at the Duchess and finishing his story. He added that this is how everything happened while they were looking for her, to which Adeline only sighed. Trying to understand what was happening, the Duke was tired of listening to Wakwen's tales and abruptly interrupted him, telling him that he had already stopped talking and loading all sorts of nonsense, and that they had to leave. Adeline looked at her husband with amazement, trying to understand that he had come to save her, since she still couldn't believe what was happening. The Duke, looking down, also wanted to explain his act and his actions, and for that, looking at Adeline, he said that because of their last conversation, he did not kill them. But our heroine looked at her husband out of the corner of her eye, remembered him in a past life, and reasoning to herself, she said mentally that Ray is not that kind of person. So why does he keep confusing her? Here Abed carefully and evaluatively examined our heroes, and taking off his hood, he announced aloud that he had never seen anything like this, although he had seen a lot in his life. The couple looked at Abed as if they had just noticed his presence, but he was not surprised. And confirming his message, he asked them to explain everything to him. Captain Abed looked inquisitively at our heroes, who were staring at each other, and once again asked if someone would explain to him what was happening here. Adeline, awakening as if from a dream, turned her gaze away from her husband and then, as if remembering something, almost exclaimed aloud that thanks to Ray, she had almost forgotten her goal. Suddenly the Duchess laughed and, asking for forgiveness, told everyone that she also did not expect such a meeting, which is why she wanted to introduce herself, even if it was late, since she didn't have the right moment before. Looking directly into Abed's eyes, our heroine solemnly introduced herself, saying that she was Adeline Lawthen and that she was the wife of the Duke of Darkness, who so unceremoniously burst into this room and was now standing next to her. Abed was bewildered by this message, as he did not expect such a turn of events at all, and he asked with a broken voice if he was really the Duke of Darkness in front of him. Our heroine, smiling, invited everyone to sit at the table, have a cup of tea, or maybe something more for men and talk. Captain Abed smiled at this proposal and thought that negotiations were somewhat amusing to him. Looking at the trio in front of him, Abed had an idea, which he had not yet decided to express, that it was not about negotiations, but about concrete threats. Captain Abed suspiciously looked at the Duchess, who was sitting at the table, at Meven, standing behind her, and at the Duke of Darkness, who looked sadly and at the same time cautiously. Abed, taking a cup in his hand, at first wanted to ask what they wanted to threaten about, but then he changed his mind, and after taking a big sip of beer, he clarified what they wanted to talk about. Our heroine smiled with satisfaction, stared intently at the man sitting in front of her, and invited the head of the Eagle clan to become his husband's faithful knight. To this proposal, Abed exclaimed in astonishment that she was probably joking, and Ray, in turn, was surprised that the heroine called him husband. But the Duke looked at the captain and said sadly that he really didn't like something in his wife's words. But Abed looked sadly at the Duke and took another sip of beer, and wondering what would be the best way to respond to this strange proposal. From the Duchess, he only said that it was very sour. Captain Abed raised his head and, looking at our heroine, addressed her by calling her lady. But the Duchess interrupted him and asked him to call her simply Adeline. Abed obediently agreed to call the Duchess by her name and immediately wanted to ask her if she knew what the mercenaries were doing. Adeline calmly looked at the captain and said that she would really make such an offer to the head of the Eagle clan if she didn't know what the mercenaries were doing. Captain Abed seemed embarrassed, which was not at all typical of him, and replied a little nervously that he did not mean it seriously. Abed, casting an ironic glance at the Duke, turned to him and said that if he was not mistaken, he was now in front of Horace Bensark himself, whom not even the Emperor dared to touch. Captain Abed immediately smiled, and without taking his eyes off the Duke, asked if they really needed a mercenary like him. And he added in a lower voice that, moreover, the Black Wind had a very bad reputation. Adeline calmly took a sip of tea and casually said that she was very aware of Blackwind's reputation. And despite the man sitting in front of her, she continued the story that the head of the Eagle clan does everything that brings money, and your name means that only despair remains after that. Then Adeline raised her beautiful eyes, looked directly at Captain Abed, and provocatively asked him if what he said was true. And squinting, she called the captain by his full name, Avid Cant. Astonishment and confusion shone in Avid's eyes, as he could not understand how the Duchess knew his old surname. Captain Avid gripped the edge of the table with his hands and leaned forward a little, asking a little threateningly who she was and how she knew his old surname, which he hadn't used for a long time. Our heroine was not embarrassed by the captain's challenging tone, and while continuing to drink tea, the Duchess said that it doesn't matter how she found out, but what matters is that she knows. This calm voice and the Duchess's calm reaction calmed Abed, who agreed that it was not important, but he still wanted to find out. Captain Abed began to think about the Duchess's words and wondered if the Duke already had a lot of money. Then, why does he need him? Here another thought crossed Abed's mind. If the man in front of him is really the Duke of the Dark Lands, then he can hire anyone as a knight. Suddenly, understanding penetrated Captain Abed's consciousness, and he began to talk about this with the Duchess. But Adeline interrupted him mid-sentence, suggesting that she understood everything. But Abed continued with his conclusion, saying that since knights with good skills will not set foot in the lands of darkness, that's why it's easier for them to hire mercenaries who will do anything for money. Our heroine, getting up from her seat, agreed with all of Captain Abed's conclusions, adding only that this is only one of the reasons why they want to hire him. And already leaving the table, Adeline, turning to Abed, said that in addition to everything, she was also confident that the people of his clan would become outstanding knights. Captain Abed raised his head, interested at that moment, and asked the Duchess why she was so sure of it. Adeline smiled mischievously and almost sang in an angelic voice that it was obvious. And then she apologized and added that the rest of the information was a secret and she couldn't tell him. Captain Abid laughed sarcastically as he realized that the Duchess was subtly mocking him, addressing Duke Bensark, who was silently watching the conversation between his wife and the mercenary. Captain Abid directly asked if his wife had always been so stubborn. Our hero did not answer this question from the captain, but Wakan looked cheerfully at the Duke and cheerfully said that this was her charm. And the Duke, coming out of his thoughtful state, suddenly said quietly that sometimes he himself wanted to know what thoughts were swirling in his little head. Captain Abid sat down at the table in front of a glass of beer and wondered what to do, since perhaps death awaited him and his clan, and perhaps a rich reward. Exhaling sharply and rubbing his face with his hand, Captain Abid began to rant that let's say his clan would join the Order of Knights. But what could they offer them in return? Our heroine reacted with understanding to this answer from the captain and said that in return, they offer safe accommodation and money in addition to training. But Captain Abid was surprised that this is really all they can offer, and he sarcastically added that they already have all this. And what kind of negotiations will it be if they offer them something that is not entirely appropriate? The Duke and Huacan instantly grabbed their swords, showing with their entire appearance that they were ready to defend the Duchess. But the Duchess, showing her calmness, which positively affected all participants in the conversation, decided to clarify with Abid what he then wanted for her and for the clan. Captain Abid, after thinking for a moment and with a clear smile in his voice, and as if thinking to himself, he said that let's say he wants the whole world, the entire Roman continent. Adeline slowly approached the table and, tapping her fingers, admitted that this was an interesting proposal, since she didn't believe that they dreamed of conquering the entire continent. Abid, seeing the Duchess's confusion, proclaimed with a satisfied smile that for his mercenary clan to become knights, they had to accept this condition. Adeline smiled shyly and said disappointed that apparently she was mistaken, since it turns out that Abid's world is only one continent. Captain Abid thought that the Duchess had misunderstood him, so he said with irony in his voice that if for her this is only one continent, then now they are talking about unimaginable things. Suddenly, Captain Abid felt as if a bucket of ice water had been poured on him. While hearing something he clearly didn't expect, he heard the name Alice. Our heroine looked at Abid with sympathy, understanding what was going through his head, and pronouncing every word he said. She thought that Alice was Captain Abid's world. Captain Abid abruptly stood up so that the chair behind him overturned. But Adeline, paying no attention to his reaction, continued to say that what he had said was not actually true. Abid looked angrily at the Duchess and, shouting like a wounded animal, tried to ask her how she knew everything. And how did she know about Alice? Duke Bensark approached the captain and spoke to him quietly, but quite threateningly, so that the captain lowered his voice. Captain Abid picked up his chair, slumped down exhausted, and quietly asked the Duchess to tell him everything. But our heroine was in no hurry to satisfy Captain Abid's request, and the captain, in despair, banged his fist on the table. Then Coquin approached the captain, and trying not to provoke the boss's anger, he addressed him, but Captain Abid did not listen to his subordinate. He looked forward with a blind gaze, and then, in a muffled voice, once again asked the Duchess to tell him everything, and asked her with hope in his eyes if he could really find Alice. Our heroine looked at Captain Abid sitting in front of her, and the captain simply sighed. Without lifting his head, so that no one could see his true feelings, he asked the Duchess if she could really find Alice. Adeline understood what was going through the head of the Eagle clan, and calmly, adding confidence to her voice, she affirmatively replied. Captain Abid looked at the Duchess with the gaze of a man who had lost everything in his life, and with some hidden hope. Suddenly, Abid stood up from his chair and crossed his arms defiantly on his chest, and said that he did not know where the Duchess found out about Alice, but that he did not intend to become a knight just for her. Adeline lowered her head and sadly told the captain that he would definitely regret it if he refused this offer. Then Captain Abid wanted to tell our heroine that all this looked like blackmail, but only a roar escaped his chest. Adeline looked at her interlocutor with sympathy and said that she knew well what he was going through now, and she understood that he could not accept this offer so easily because he was afraid that they would simply use him, and then they would throw him away. The head of the Eagle clan agreed with the conclusion the Duchess came to, and firmly added that this is why he hates aristocrats. Looking directly into the Duchess's eyes, Captain Abid abruptly added that it is unbearable when you are used, and then thrown away as something unnecessary. At these words, Adeline, bowing her head, whispered with pain in her voice that this feeling was familiar to her. And suddenly, leaning towards the Duchess, Abed abruptly and angrily shouted, "How could an aristocrat like her understand his feelings?" Strong words about the deception of aristocrats burst from the captain's lips, about their betrayal, to which the Duchess silently agreed with him. Looking down and trying not to cry in front of everyone, Adeline quietly added that she would not like to know all this. The Duchess's calm voice made Captain Abed fall silent and think about what he had just heard from the Duchess. Here our heroine raised her head and smiled cheerfully, giving him another chance to make a positive decision. And she said that in any case, since he does not trust her, then her proposal has a condition. And Adeline made the captain a proposal to set the contract term at 6 months, to which Abed only confusingly repeated his proposal. Our heroine, in the tone of a teacher who once again tells the students the topic of the lesson, she explained to the captain that she wants them to become knights who will be useful to the Duke. And Captain Abed wants to find Alice. And already with a friendly smile, Adeline asked how about they prove their worth to each other in 6 months. The head of the Eagle clan, reflecting on the Duchess's words, thoughtfully said that, in other words, if in 6 months Alice is not with him, then his clan can renounce the title of knight. Adeline confirmed the accuracy of the captain's thoughts and explained to the other side of the agreement that if his skills did not change in any way, then he should forget about Alice. Captain Abed lowered his head and sadly said that if it were up to him, he would accept immediately. But he has subordinates and cannot be responsible for them. Koking instantly approached the captain and, grabbing his head by the shoulder, abruptly proclaimed that the captain had accepted this proposal without hesitation. The head of the Eagle clan raised his head and looked at his subordinate in bewilderment, as if seeing him for the first time, and asked him again what he was saying. To this question, Koking began to confidently express to the clan leader that now the captain had a chance to find Alice, whom he was looking for so desperately. Here, Kokin moved away from the captain and pointed to the men behind him, and as if confirming his assurances, he solemnly said that in any case, if it were not for the captain, they would not be here either. Therefore, the captain must accept the Duchess's proposal. Moreover, the boss's wish is the wish of the entire clan. Kokin turned to the boys from the Eagle clan and cheerfully announced that they could finally leave this dirty mercenary life, to which his comrades began to ask with interest if knights do not do cool things. And what about the knight's oath? Captain Abed looked at his subordinates with amazement, who were already preparing to become knights and discussing future actions, and he could not believe the reality of the events. Our heroine quietly approached the captain, but the captain heard her footsteps and asked him if he heard what his subordinates were talking about. Suddenly, the captain exclaimed enthusiastically that his subordinates were the best people, and turning to the Duchess, he decided to clarify to her that she agreed with him. Adeline looked at the captain, at his people, and smiling cheerfully confirmed Abed's words, adding that these people were simply magnificent. Later, repeating this event in her head, our heroine came to the conclusion that the negotiations with Abed ended quite quickly, and that his subordinates would sort out their personal affairs in a month. And foreseeing the future, Adeline reasoned that for Captain Abed and his clan to arrive safe and sound to the forest, it was necessary to send someone with them. Captain Abed looked at the Duchess, and after hearing what he heard, asked her in surprise if she really wanted to use a fast ship. And how did she know? The Duchess, without going into details, explained that she had business on Mavin Island, and to go unnoticed, they decided to go there alone, the three of them. Here Captain Abed thought for a moment, chuckled, and ironically asked the Duchess if they had at least any chance to refuse her. At these words, Adeline only burst out laughing. The head of the Eagle clan, waving his hand, only said to let the Duchess do as she wished. Finally, the Duke and Duchess were left alone, and Adeline looked at her husband, and she thought that he assumed everything would be fine. But it turns out that things do not always go as planned. Our heroes had dinner at a luxurious restaurant. Ray sat at the table opposite Adeline, and as always when they were alone, he remained silent and ate indifferently. Our heroine, somewhat indignant, tried to attract her husband's attention. Our heroine frantically cut a piece of meat on a plate, as if trying to vent all her indignation. The Duchess decided to be the first to break the prolonged silence, and turning to her husband, she wanted to know where Bakan was now, to which the Duke replied that he had already eaten his fill and had gone to rest. Adeline looked thoughtfully at her plate of food and realized that she could not make the Duke talk. Here the Duchess was embarrassed, thinking that she and the Duke were now alone, and this made him extremely uncomfortable. Adeline was afraid to look at her husband. She looked around the table set with various dishes and thought that, of course, they eat together at home. But they did not have such an atmosphere. Suddenly, Ray was overcome by an incomprehensible feeling and raising his head. He stared intently at his wife and thought that it was. The Duke suddenly remembered how, in a conversation with David about aristocrats acting dishonestly and having used their people, they then discard them as unnecessary. Adeline said that she knew this feeling. The Duke lowered his gaze to his plate again, but did not eat. But he remembered the expression on his wife's face at the moment she spoke about this. Ray raised his head again and looked at our heroine, and again felt that incomprehensible feeling that had overcome him before. Our hero looked at his wife and mentally asked her why he felt that she had been enduring a tearing loneliness for a long time. Suddenly, as if feeling that she was being watched, Adeline raised her head and saw Ray looking at her strangely. Our heroine, with hidden hope, thought that her husband still wanted to talk to her, but he didn't dare. She decided to help him in this by asking if maybe he wanted to tell her something. The Duke suddenly became embarrassed, realizing that he had been caught doing such an indecent activity as staring at his wife. And he muttered quietly that he didn't want any of that. Then the Duke got up from the table and handed the bag to his wife, telling her to hold it. And Adeline, like a child, was happy and enthusiastically declared that she thought he had lost it. Our hero began to explain that it was Coking who took the bag, since apparently he was thinking of getting some money when he kidnapped the Duchess, to which Adeline only burst out laughing. Suddenly, the Duke, abruptly raising his head, declared in a firm voice that he felt magic in this bag. Adeline, not ceasing to admire the find, cheerfully said that this is true. She found this bag in the shop, and, surprisingly, everything that cannot fit in it goes there. Our hero lowered his head and muttered something to himself like, "Oh, so that's it." And Adeline thought it was a relief that Ray didn't ask her anything important. The Duke raised his head again, looked at his wife without blinking. It seemed as if he was seeing her for the first time, and he tried to engrave this image in his head. Adeline looked at her husband in bewilderment and asked him why he was looking at her like that again. And then, taking a sip of wine from a glass, she added that if someone saw him, they would think he was looking at her because he thought she was beautiful. But our hero did not immediately answer his wife's question and continued to look at her. Adeline already thought that her husband was not going to answer her and turned to look at the aisle where they were sitting, when suddenly Ray announced quite abruptly that everything was fine. The Duchess looked at the Duke in bewilderment and with a broken voice asked him what he was saying, to which the Duke confirmed that everything was true and he was looking at her because he found her beautiful. Here our hero looked closely at his wife and added quietly that her face turned red. The Duke tried to find words to describe the touching blush on his wife's cheeks, but his hardened heart gave no clues, and he said the first thing that came to mind, that she was quite cute now and looked like a peach. Looking at her husband and trying to cope with her already burning face, our heroine thought that her husband was truly crazy if he said such things. Our hero looked at his wife and asked her in bewilderment if she didn't like being called darling. Adeline was confused by such a question. She even asked again as if she hadn't heard him, and began to say that she simply did not understand what he was talking about. Our heroine lowered her head and began to examine the food on her plate, as if trying to find the answer to the Duke's question in it, or simply avoid answering it. Gathering courage, the Duchess raised her head and, looking at her husband, stuttered that it was too unexpected, and that she would not say that she did not like it. Adeline wanted to say something else, but interrupted herself mid-sentence and began to think deeply. Our heroine, thinking back to her past, thought that she still hadn't managed to escape from the past. The Duchess looked at her husband, and the idea that she saw him not only within the limits of the real image that now calls her darling did not leave her. Without taking her eyes off the Duke, Adeline continued to think that she could also see him, and the personality from the past that was moving away from her. Another strange thought came to the Duchess's head. If she starts to feel the slightest affection for her husband, then this regrettable past begins to haunt her. Here, Adeline mentally turned to herself and said that she really wanted to be hurt again, that she really believed that he loved her. And our heroine thought again about Ray, who unfortunately in the past, when he tried to do something for her, she felt happiness and discomfort. Sharply shaking off her stupor and smiling, Adeline casually said that it was fine. and she decided to check with her husband if he really keeps his promises. And even when he calls her darling, they look like a real couple. Now the Duke was lost in thought and kept trying to find the right words and how to respond more precisely. Our hero, looking at his hands, ordered his thoughts and then, slowly, he clenched his fist and replied that he was telling her about her beauty because Adeline was his wife. The Duchess lowered her eyes, trying to hide the tears that had appeared, and quietly, with some disguised sadness, she said that she was posing as the Duke's wife for the common good. The Duke looked into his wife's eyes and wanted to say some tender and kind words to her. But when he saw his reflection in the tears welling up in her eyes, he fell silent. Adeline could no longer stand this conversation and abruptly got up from her chair. She apologized to her husband and, saying that she had lost her appetite, prepared to leave. As she headed for the exit to leave the restaurant, the Duchess still turned to her husband and asked him to forgive her if she left first. Our hero quickly got up from his seat, approached his wife, and took her hand, trying to stop her because he wanted to tell her many things. But he didn't know how. Ray looked at his wife, not understanding what was wrong with her and why she was leaving, and in a voice full of tenderness, he said that it was she who called him. But then the voice trembled, and the Duke fell silent, swallowing the lump that had formed in his throat, and without letting go of his wife's hand. The Duke continued that it was she who called him her husband. Adeline, confused, first looked at the hand holding her. Then she looked at her husband, and Ray, catching her gaze quietly, said that he liked hearing when she called him her husband. The Duchess looked at her husband, and thoughts spun in her head like a whirlwind, from which she wanted to laugh or pay. Adeline understood that she could not continue this conversation now, especially since they were not at home, but in a place where there were many strangers, and she, asking to leave the IR, was the first to pull her hand away. Restraining herself with all her might, Adeline walked towards the exit with a proud step, wishing the Duke a good meal and farewell. In the distance, in the hall, conversations and laughter of the restaurant's visitors could be heard. Life went on as usual. Our hero sat at the table completely alone with his thoughts, staring at one point, not noticing anything or anyone around him. After sitting for a while in the restaurant hall alone with his thoughts, Duke Horace Bensark suddenly realized that he wanted to see Adeline smile again. Having come to this conclusion, our hero sat down relaxed and, closing his eyes, he imagined his wife's image again and realized that he needed nothing more than her. The Duke sat in the restaurant again and again, returning to the image of his wife, imagining the soft curls of her hair, her radiant eyes, and her cheerful smile. Then, our hero realized that he thought about his wife like a boy in love, and that it was funny even to think about it, because in reality, he was trying to win her favor. But turning his thoughts again to the image of Adeline and reflecting on the feelings he has for her, the Duke suggested that the emotions he felt at first irritated him, but still, seeing her smile was enough for him. But something worried our hero. Some unknown reasons pursued him. The Duke reflected more and more on the relationship that had developed between him and his wife and wondered why it seemed to him that something was wrong. Our hero understood that building good and trusting family relationships is not so easy, and even difficult. Having already arrived home, the Duke did not stop his thoughts. Even when he went to bed, his thoughts returned again and again to his wife. Suddenly, our hero saw a richly decorated room with expensive armchairs and carpets, rich curtains, and chandeliers. The Duke examined the living room, the interior again, and this place seemed very familiar to him. A vague guess flashed through his head, and when he saw the man he recognized, the Duke was sure that he was in Count Lawton's mansion. Ray looked at the Count and did not understand how he could have ended up in the Count's mansion and what he was doing here, because he was sure that he had fallen asleep after dinner. Our hero wanted to approach the Count and greet him, but to his even greater surprise, he could not move. His legs seemed to be nailed to the floor. Several thoughts flashed through the Duke's head, and each one was more unthinkable than the other. But one thought firmly imprinted in his head was that this was really the work of Asura. Then, our hero heard Count Lawton tell someone that he did not want to show her to Duke Bensark because he was behaving inappropriately. And the Duke realized that he had already lived this day, as on that day he met Adeline for the first time. But suddenly, Ray saw a man approaching the Count and realized that he was looking at himself. Our hero was simply in shock, as he certainly did not expect to see himself from the outside. And this incomprehensible phenomenon greatly irritated him. The Duke grabbed his head with his hands to put his thoughts in order and tried to understand what was happening to him. Suddenly, the idea occurred to the Duke that perhaps this was only a dream. But he realized that it couldn't be so. Our hero, so as not to go crazy, tried to think reasonably and understood that devas do not sleep. But if this is not a dream, then perhaps it is a prophecy. But at the same time, the Duke understood that he could not call this knowledge a prophecy either, since he had the impression that he was seeing not the future, but the past. So, the Duke looked at himself and heard his thoughts from the side that he was doing what Oz said. But do I really need to marry her? The next thought the Duke heard from himself was that they could catch her and lock her up. So, why was marriage necessary? And then, our hero was surprised that he really thought so at that moment. The Duke looked at himself from the outside and began to understand why Adeline was now building walls between them, and how unpleasant it was. Then the Duke saw his butler approach Count Lowton and Beau. He announced that Lady Adeline had arrived. Our hero suddenly thought that he could never forget this day, because when he first saw Adeline, his whole world changed, and he imagined their first meeting. He remembered a fragile, slightly embarrassed girl with a bright face shrouded in a halo of blonde hair, who walked proudly towards him. But our hero's thoughts were interrupted by the threatening voice of Count Lowton, who demandingly asked Adeline, who was looking down, why she was silent, and immediately told her to greet the Duke. The Duke looked at himself and saw him standing with an inscrutable face, and with slight disdain asking the girl if she was Adeline Lawton. Adeline, still not raising her eyes, quietly said that she was pleased to meet you. The Duke looked at the pretty girl standing there and brokenly added that her name was Adeline Lawton. In front of Duke, Bensark stood a fragile girl who quietly said that her name was Adeline Lawton and added that she was pleased to meet you. Our hero looked at himself, who looked with disdain at his fiancée and listened as she said in an embarrassed voice that she hoped they would get along in the future. Our hero looked at the girl and did not understand anything. He tried to remember if Adeline was really like that, but the Duke immediately refuted his assumptions because he remembered that Adeline was more confident. The Duke remembered that, when he first met Adeline, her eyes looked at him with pride, and she did not lower her gaze. But then why? When he now glanced at the first meeting with Adeline, he did not see a proud woman, but an insecure girl with a frightened look. Ray glanced sideways at himself and remembered how he called her, and passed by without offering her his hand. The Duke clearly remembered how, passing by the girl, she lowered her head to hide the tears that had welled up in her eyes. Our hero looked at himself passing by the girl, as if not noticing her, but she asked to accompany him. The Duke watched from the side how Adeline, looking back, looked at the Duke, and could barely hold back tears. Our hero watched this whole situation from the outside, his actions towards the girl, and he did not understand why he acted that way, what motivated him at that moment. Then the Duke saw Aster approach him and say in a choked voice that he had said that the Duke's fiancée was not at all interested in this marriage. Aster followed the Duke and told him that, as he had told him, Adeline Lawton simply had a weak will. But the Duke, paying no attention to his friend's words, abruptly said that as long as Adeline Lawton did her job correctly, it didn't matter at all, and Aster supported the Duke in this. Here Aster, smiling mischievously, tried to clarify with the Duke if Adeline could be of any use. The Duke looked angrily at his friend and said through clenched teeth that he was one of those who actively promoted the idea of this marriage. And Aster quickly confirmed the Duke's words. Without waiting for his young wife, Duke Horace Bensark walked towards the exit of the mansion and scolded Aster that if she still turned out to be useless in this marriage, he suddenly fell silent, after thinking about what he could do with his wife if she turned out to be a useless wife. The Duke lightly said that they could simply bring her back here. Our hero, listening from the sidelines how he and his friend Aster so easily controlled, and carelessly, the fate of the girl who became his wife and duchess. Then our hero saw Adeline, who no longer hid her feelings, and tears rolled down her face. And he realized that the girl had heard everything that the Duke and Aster were talking about. Suddenly, the picture changed, and now the Duke is holding the unconscious body of Adeline in his arms. After being moved by teleportation, Aster approached and said in an excited voice that it is quite difficult for an ordinary person to endure teleportation. And this is quite problematic, since in the future they were going to move like this many times. The Duke looked at his wife's closed eyes, listened to her labored breathing, and wondered how long her faint would last, because they needed to move on. Our hero, looking at this situation from the outside, remembered that he was sure that Adele was completely fine after teleportation. But why is she like this in this dream of his? And the Duke had no choice but to look at his wife, and involuntarily began to notice the beauty of her eyes, the softness of her wavy blonde hair. Then, the Duke looked down and saw the soft curve of pink lips, through which white teeth like snow were visible. The Duke, still examining his young wife, carefully stroked her head and, running his hands through her blonde hair, he noticed that the girl was very beautiful. Our hero, watching this scene from the side and experiencing the same emotions as the Duke, wondered if their emotions were synchronized or if he was still going crazy. Our hero thought about this situation and came to the disappointing conclusion that it seems he has gone mad. But the fact that Adeline is beautiful cannot be argued with. At that moment, the Duchess took a deep breath, regained consciousness, and her eyelashes fluttered. Adeline opened her eyes, and the first person she saw was her newly appointed husband, Duke Horace Bensark, who, holding her in his arms, leaned over her. Our heroine exclaimed with fear, and immediately her beautiful face turned red, which made her even sweeter and more helpless. Adeline jumped up, and bowing her head and hiding her beautiful eyes, she began to apologize to the Duke, saying that she was very sorry for what had happened. The Duke looked at his wife in bewilderment, who was running away from him, then looked at his hands and thought that she really hated his touch. Then, clenching his fists, the Duke thought that he must be careful with her. Perhaps he had hurt her in some way, but she dared not admit it. Our hero, examining and thinking about this situation from the outside, remembered from his meeting with Adeline that it seemed he was also dissatisfied for the same reason. Here, Adeline decided to ask the Duke where they were, but she remained timidly at a distance, and did not turn to her husband. The Duke looked around and waving his hand, pointing to the surroundings, said that they were in a forest of darkness. Adeline gasped involuntarily and brought her hands to her chest. Suddenly, something crunched in the foliage of the trees, and the girl screamed in fear. Her beautiful eyes opened, and she looked in shock into the thicket of the forest. Our hero looked at Adeline sideways with bewilderment, because he did not understand why she was afraid, because he knows that she is not the shy type. And the Duke, throwing a hostile look at his wife, said irritably that, whether she liked it or not, from now on she would have to live here. And then, the Duke added sadly that it would be better for her to quickly get used to the place where her new home was now located. Adelaide looked at the Duke with guilt, and looking around shyly, she began to ask the Duke for forgiveness for her unworthy act. Duke Bensark interrupted Adeline's speech with a wave of his hand, and said in a firm voice that it was enough to sit, and that it was time to go. Then he turned around and walked towards Astor. The Duke, walking with Astor towards the carriage, tried to be annoyed that he did not understand what he could talk about with his wife. Duke Bensark began to think about his own words. Why couldn't he find a topic to talk about with his wife? And he answered himself, simply because he had never talked to women before. The Duke turned to the girl and called her with a disdainful speech. Adeline quietly approached the Duke and, stopping next to her, listened to the Duke say in an inflexible tone that from this day on her name was Adeline Bensark. Even though his wife, the Duke, continuing to instruct her, added that she should not just be the Duke's wife, but that she should become a useful duchess. Adeline, timidly looking at her husband, quietly told Duke Horace Bensark that she would do her best. Satisfied with the Duchess's answer, Duke Bensark turned around and walked towards the carriage. Our hero looked at himself from the outside, at his indifference and disdain for Adeline, and he scolded himself for these actions. Our hero saw from the side how Adeline walked silently alone, abandoned by the Duke, how tears appeared in her eyes, and at that moment he felt sincere pity for the girl. And then a carriage drove up to the clearing, which was decorated with golden monograms and patterns, and the steps of the step were lined with red brocade. The sun flooded the room with bright rays. A gentle wind pulled at the light curtains, and the morning air refreshed our hero's room. Duke Horace Bensark got out of his bed and looked around, carefully observing the familiar features of his hotel room. Lost in his thoughts, trying to make sense of what he saw and realizing that something incredible had happened to him, Ray wondered if it was really a dream. Our hero went out to the balcony, breathed the morning air, and began to think about what he was seeing, being increasingly amazed that he could really see a dream. The Duke looked at the city in the morning, the roofs of the houses, people rushing about their business, and it occurred to him that he had never dreamed in the mansion, and he immediately wondered why he was having a dream now. Starting to examine his memory, especially what he knew about dreams, the Duke remembered that he had once heard that human dreams are a manifestation of an unconscious desire. Ray began to reflect on this memory, and it occurred to him if Adeline's appearance meant that he had an unconscious desire. But our hero doubted this reasoning, as he never wanted Adele to radiate melancholy, nor for her to be extremely depressed, nor for tears to well up in her eyes. And in his dream, the Duke recalled, Adeline seemed like a submissive person whom anyone could call weak and depressed, and exactly as described her before their wedding. Here our hero suddenly presented himself and the Duchess together, calling the obedient Adeline, and the Deva who sees the truth. But reasoning further, our hero realized that today's Adele never gave the impression of obedience and humility. And at that moment, in her bed, Adeline was tormented by other doubts, as she remembered the previous night, and constantly wondered what she should do. Adeline remembered dinner at a restaurant, how she left the establishment, and assumed that she had left too early, leaving her husband alone. The Duchess tried to understand what feelings her husband had at that moment, and wrinkling the edge of the blanket between her hands, she suggested that he must have felt very unpleasant about her action. Our heroine sat up in bed, stared at one spot, and continued to think that even if Ray had changed a lot compared to his former self, most likely he was still disappointed with her. The Duchess lowered her head and, trying to hold back the tears welling up in her eyes, tried to ward off the idea that the events of the past were really returning, and something needed to be done to prevent it. Suddenly, like an idea, our heroine had a simple solution to this situation, and she jumped on the bed, realizing that she just needed to apologize to her husband for leaving the restaurant in a hurry. Adeline quickly jumped out of bed, put on her slippers, thought for a moment, dismissed all doubts, and headed determinedly towards her husband's room. The heroine walked to Ray's room and thought to herself that she was still afraid of falling in love with him again, but somehow she didn't want to feel uncomfortable being next to him. Ray was still standing on the balcony when the door to the room opened, and hearing the Duchess's calm voice, he replied by saying that he only had one question for her. Adeline entered the room with some shyness. She looked inside, noticed that it was quite cozy, and went out to the balcony to her husband, trying to predict what he wanted to ask her at such an early hour. The Duke remained motionless near the balcony railing, without making a single move towards the Duchess. And Adeline, approaching and looking him in the face, anxiously asked if something had happened. The Duke, hesitating slightly in his answer, said that everything was fine for him, but that something interested him, and looking at his wife, he asked her if she had ever seen dreams. Adeline was surprised by such a question. So confused, she replied with a question. Is there anyone who doesn't have dreams? But she immediately decided to soften her question, and smiling, said that unlike seers, Devas dream of nothing, but immediately asked why Ray was asking about this. Ray was even more confused, but trying to get out of the awkward situation, he muttered that he was just curious if she had dreamed anything last night, to which Adeline, thoughtfully, said that she definitely did not remember, but in reality, lately she hadn't remembered any dreams. After thinking a little more, our heroine added that simply after waking up, dreams are forgotten almost immediately, and, immediately regaining her senses, she asked Ray if he was really talking in his sleep, and that was why he was asking about it. The Duke was still there, lost in his thoughts, and did not immediately answer his wife's question. But then, looking at her, he said that he was just curious about things called dreams. Adeline looked thoughtfully at her husband, realizing that something had happened, and immediately wondered if Ray had a dream. So, what was it about? The Duke, at that moment looking at Adeline, reasoned that it did not seem like anything unusual had happened to her, and whether this meant that he was the only one of the Devas who had a dream. Our heroine, deciding to break the silence, began to say that she wanted to talk about last night, that she thought it was a mistake to leave so suddenly, so she would like to apologize. But loudly banging the railing with his fist, our hero abruptly interrupted his wife's speech, shouting that she must not dare to do this. Adeline fell silent in fright, not understanding what in her apology could cause such anger, and what she should not do, and in an intermittent voice asked her husband what he was talking about. The Duke, still angry, staring intently at his wife, sharply said that she must not dare to apologize. Our heroine looked at her husband bewildered and tried to explain her action, but Ray still rudely said that he did not need her apologies. Then, the Duke realized that he had gotten too excited, and already scolding himself for the harsh words he had spoken. He thought with curses that he kept remembering Adele from his dream. Adeline lowered her head, hiding the tears in her eyes, and began to scold herself for crossing the line again. Although what else could she expect from the Duke? She looked at her husband, frozen like a statue, who was looking at the morning city. And it flashed in her thoughts that Ray had always been like this and would not change. The Duchess abruptly turned so that her husband would not see her tears, and saying that it was time for breakfast. She called him and offered to go down, as Wakhan must already be waiting for them. Ray looked at Adeline as she left and wondered why she seemed so sad, as in his dream. And the first impulse of the Duke was to stop his wife, hug her, and then assure her of his protection and trust in the future. Wakhan seemed rested, and when he saw the couple happily chewing their kebab, he said that eating outside was simply great, and that the only reason he participates in missions outside the home is food. The couple approached Wakhan and Adeline, laughing, told him that of course the food in the duchy was not as good, and that was why she kept going on missions, to which Wakhan timidly scratched the back of his neck and asked the Duchess not to tell him anything. Oz about this. Adeline, as if thinking about Wakhan's request, and laughing quietly, said that, of course, she would think about it. But then Wakhan, in a tragic voice, began to beg her not to tell Az anything. Our heroine, who had already laughed heartily, said that she would leave the men for a while and would go for a drink. Wakhan, with a cheerful smile and pleased with himself, waved his hand at the Duchess and shouted to her to come back quickly, as they were waiting for her. Wakhan waved his hand at the departing Duchess, exclaiming at the same time that she should not delay. And our hero looked thoughtfully at his wife and then turned his gaze to his friend. Only then did Bacon draw attention to the captain's thoughtful appearance, and asking if he had really quarreled with Adeline, he looked at the Duke bewildered, who did not answer his question. Bacon's indignation knew no bounds, and he exclaimed enthusiastically that yesterday he even deliberately left them alone so that they could have dinner together. But not seeing any reaction from the captain, Bacon angrily added that the Duke understands that today the couple didn't even talk. But our hero did not react in any way to his friend's exclamation, and only after saying that it was not easy for him either, he asked for silence, to which Wacken cursed, and said that this was really exasperating. Here Wacken thought deeply, and remembered Mavin's words, who said that he should not interfere with spouses, that at any opportunity he would disappear, and that they could be alone at that moment. Through the veil of memories, the Duke's voice reached Wacken, who asked him if he had ever seen dreams. And Wacken, thinking he had misheard, asked the captain exactly what he was asking about dreams. Realizing that the Duke was not joking, Wacken still thought about it, and confidently replied that he had never had dreams, to which our hero again asked if Wacken had really never seen a single dream. Seeing how the Duke remained thoughtful, Wacken replied that he really had not had dreams, and decided to ask him why he was asking about such obvious things, and immediately solemnly added that he had never had dreams. To which the Duke, turning to Asia, asked him, his head what he knew about Oz, maybe he was dreaming. Wakwent, already angry with the captain, since he did not answer his questions, shouted why should he know if Oz is having dreams, or not, that the captain should ask Oz himself. To suppress the anger that had flared up, Wakan again began to chew the meat, saying that despite the content, if one of them had dreamed something, the captain would have known immediately. And suddenly, chilled, Wakan stared intently at the captain and asked, "Why are you asking about this? Did you really dream of something?" Our hero, making an effort and giving his voice an indifferent tone, said that he had not dreamed of anything. He was just wondering if it was possible to see a dream that is not a vision. At this, Wakan looked at the Duke in surprise and said that the captain thinks about such strange things. Seeing that the captain was still thoughtful, Wakan began to rant about the matter, saying that he lived for more than 100 years before entering Nirvana, but that he had never heard of Deva's dreaming. After thinking a little more, Wakan added that if this happened, then rumors about it would spread instantly, since this was extremely unusual, and that perhaps the one who saw the dreams would be ashamed of it. Then Ray raised his head and asked what Wakan had in mind. After a short silence, Wakan said that he had heard that dreams help people protect their weak psyche, that it is something like self-hypnosis, that is, a hypnotic state caused by a person on their own initiative. Our hero listened to his friend and subordinate, and he himself thought that perhaps he had a dream that Devas should not see, and Devas really saw a dream to protect their psyche. At such a conclusion, the captain choked on his drink and began to clear his throat loudly, and Wakan did nothing but exclaim for the captain to try to calm down. Then the Duchess approached the table. She cheerfully called the men gentlemen, asked them if they had finished eating, and looking at the men sitting at the table, she noticed that Wakwent seemed excited, and the Duke, on the contrary, sat very thoughtfully. Our heroine did not focus on the emotional states of her companions, and said that it was time for them to move on. Bakken looked at the Duke with surprise first. Then he turned his gaze to the Duchess, and still, decided to ask if they were really going somewhere. Adeline laughed as if it were an old joke, and intrigued, asked Wackend if he had really forgot. Because they were going to win money at a gladiator tournament. Looking at the men's surprised faces, Adeline, without losing her good humor, said that since they were going to gladiator fights, she should know how much money they had at that moment. The Duke took out a wallet with money and handed it to Bakan, who, counting the contents, said that he had 10 gold pieces, 50 silver pieces, and about 655 talents. Adeline watched as Bakan counted the money and thoughtfully said that it was great that they had such a sum. Here our heroine looked at Wakana, then turned her gaze to her husband, and looking him in the eyes, she held out her hand, and with a tempting smile said that they would give him all this money. Adeline, accompanied by her husband and a devoted gentleman, arrived at the square where the gladiator tournament was to be held. But bets were already being placed. Upon approaching the standings, our travelers began to look at the names of the participants in the fights. And the time of the fights, Adeline carefully examined all the information about the fighters, and suggested that the only one they should pay attention to is the fighter called the Great Underworld Thief. Addressing Wackent, the Ukwesa decided to check with the gentleman if it was true that he also knew this fighter. Wacken, without hesitation, replied that he was sure that everyone knew him, as this fighter constantly won gladiator fights, which is why many would bet on the victory of the Great Underworld Thief. Adeline thought for a moment about what she had just heard, and repeating Wakana's words quietly, she said that indeed, there would be many people here who, like him, would only bet on this fighter. The Duke and Wakwin looked at the Duchess with some bewilderment. They listened to her reasoning, and Adeline, still reasoning, said that now only one question arises. Looking at her husband and Wacken, the Duchess, still thinking, said that the whole question is how we can win all the money that people will bet on the Great Underworld Thief. Wacken joined the Duchess's thoughts and suggested that he should bet on her opponent, and the Great Thief would miraculously have to lose. Here Adeline laughed heartily. The Duke and Wackwind looked bewilderedly at the laughing Duchess, and the latter said that most likely they had no chance. But our heroine, laughing and calming down, suddenly smiled mischievously, and said with joyful delight that this is what is needed. This is the correct answer. Adeline looked at her husband and said conspiratorially that in the final, she would bet absolutely all the money on the Great Thief's opponent. Here the Duchess smiled, and ignoring the suddenly grim faces of her companions, she spoke intriguingly so that Ray and Wakan would watch the duel themselves and see what result it would end with. In the bookmaker's room, the owner of the betting house, looking at a sheet of paper with a bet of 10 golds, 50 silvers and 600 talents that had been bet on Wolf Fang, perplexed, said, "Why bet so much money on such scum?" The owner immediately asked his employee, who accepted the offer, if he was sure that they had personally sealed the sheet. The impassive bookmaker, without looking up from reading the newspaper, said that he was absolutely sure that the girl herself had put the seal on it, and that there was no reason for them to refuse to accept the bet if she wanted to lose all her money on it. The owner leaned back in his chair and nodded to his employee with a smile of satisfaction. Then the owner jumped out of his chair and intensely asked his employee how the Great Underworld Thief was doing, to which the bookmaker, still impassive, without stopping reading the newspaper, replied that the Great Thief had reached the semifinals without a single scratch. But the owner was still not satisfied with this answer, and immediately asked about the Wolf Fang that the girl had bet on. The bookmaker thought for a moment, and disdainfully said that this guy looked like a beaten ass, and that the fact that he reached the final was pure coincidence. Looking up from reading the newspaper, the bookmaker said that he had been watching him closely, since he was curious about what kind of person he was, as such a sum was bet on him, but he came to the conclusion that he was not worthy of attention. The owner looked at his employee, who was already lying on the sofa smoking a cigar. He pointed to his watch and said that the finals would arrive soon. The bookmaker jumped up from his seat, put out his cigar, and threw the newspaper on the table, cheerfully proclaiming that the time had come, and that they would go to win the jackpot, and his companions went to the arena to watch the fight. And in the arena, amidst shouts and noise of voices, the commentator, trying to shout to be heard, shouted at the top of his lungs that the great underworld thief was entering the arena, and the final was starting well. Now, and after a while, the Duke and Wackwind looked at the bag of gold in amazement, and Adeline, pleased with herself, cheerfully proclaimed that in the bag there were 2,000 gold coins, which she had won in bets today. Bakhan could not resist first, and with some fear or genuine delight, said in an intermittent voice that there really were 2,000 gold coins here, because he was sure that there would only be 10 gold coins and 50 silver pieces with kopecks. The cheerful Duchess still enthusiastically reported that the money in this bag had increased to 2,000. And Bakhan at that moment thought that 1 gold piece was enough for 2 commoners to live their whole life. Adeline, pleased by the uproar that had arisen, said more calmly that they could leave, and that there was no reason to stay here, since they had achieved their goal. But then a man's voice came from the side, asking them to stay. The Duchess turned towards the bewildered voice, trying to understand who had decided to stop them, and saw in front of her a majestic old man with 2 guards. The man did not look much at our heroine, and immediately asked if Adeline Lawton was really in front of him. Our heroine took a quick assessing look at her counterpart, noticing that he had a suspicious look, and judging by the guards accompanying this old man, maybe he is the owner of the arena. The Duchess turned to the man, and straightening her shoulders, said that she really was Adeline Lawton, and immediately asked who was in front of her. The man did not introduce himself, but said sadly that he heard that Adeline had carried out an interesting adventure. But in response to his words, Adeline asked with a smile that the rumors had already spread. But the man, ignoring the girl's mocking tone, continued. He said that he heard that she won in a completely different way than others, and he wanted to know what trick she used. To his words, Adeline said that it sounded like she had cheated, and I do not expect such a small amount to be followed by an investigation. The man, confirming our heroine's words, added that everything seems like she was cheating, for which an investigation is simply necessary. Otherwise, the game will not be fun. Our heroine looked ironically into the man's eyes and assumed that since he said the game would be fun, that fun would only amuse him. Casting a fleeting glance at the Duke and Wackwind, Adeline continued to tell the gray-haired man that it was very strange that he was silent when the arena won all the money, that the spectators lost. And besides, as if explaining basic things to the man, Adeline said that now he ran towards her surprised and annoyed, since this time not everything went according to his plan. But doesn't it really seem to you that this is a little meaning? Suddenly, one of the guards, drawing his sword from its sheath, angrily shouted that she allowed herself to do this, and how could she even dare to say such words to her master? But the Duke and Huacan immediately reacted to the threatening shout, drawing their swords, and the Duke, staring at the guard, said sadly that he had better behave appropriately, since his head would immediately separate from his body if he did that. Even an extra move. The gray-haired man, quickly assessing the situation, realized that he should not act hastily, but that he needed to find out who these people were who so quickly came out in defense of the girl. The man began to look closely at the aristocrat standing next to our heroine, assuming that the Duke of Darkness was standing in front of him. And at the same time, a terrifying idea occurred to him that the girl who won the money was really the Duke's wife. Still looking at the Duke's face and confirming his assumption, the man wondered confusedly why. Of all people, it was the Duke in front of him, and in a conciliatory tone, the man said that everyone should calm down, since he did not come here to fight, because he, as the owner of the arena, was simply doing his job. And if he had known that, if the Duke was here, he would have prepared a proper reception. Having said these words, the man bowed and asked for forgiveness for not recognizing Duke Bensark, to which our hero replied that he did not believe that he was the only one who should be recognized by the owner of the arena. The gray-haired man, pointing to himself, said with a smile that this old man has hearing problems, so he doesn't understand everything very well. Duke Bensark began to explain that it was not him, but his wife, and it was she who was the victim of the arena owner's disrespectful behavior. Our hero stared at the man, who no longer had so much self-confidence, and added that he should behave appropriately if he does not want trouble. At that moment, the owner of the arena thought to himself that Duke Bensark was a very influential person, and that he could easily dismiss him if he made a mistake, and he hurried to say that he was blinded by his stupidity, and did not recognize the lady. The gray-haired man bowed, apologized, and asked for permission to greet the guests again, saying that his name was Peter, and that he was the head of the city of Mokran. Peter turned to our heroine, and seeing the Duchess's annoyed face, he leaned confidentially towards her and asked her not to hesitate to contact him for anything she might need. After bowing once more to the Duke and Duchess, the city head said that as long as the couple was in Makran, they could fully count on his help. And at that moment, in the tavern, Abed complained annoyedly that the great underworld thief really lost. But he had bet a lot of money on the great thief, so his money cried. Coquin, confirming the captain's words, said that the money really ran out quickly. And they say that the great thief made a stupid mistake during the final, to which Abed muttered that old Peter should have won a lot, and he should have worked in the arena instead of becoming a mercenary. But Coking, after thinking a little, said that about the winnings, he heard that the one who won the money was not an employee of the arena. Captain Abed looked surprised at his subordinate, and when Coking reported that Adeline Lothan had won, he angrily exclaimed why it was her, and ran out into the street with irritation. Cocken stood next to the captain on the street, and said that he heard that in the first 3 matches the Duchess bet on the great underworld thief, and in the final round he bet on Wolffang, to which Abed, returning to the tavern, asked him what he really did right by betting everything on Wolffang. The mercenaries returned to the tavern, poured themselves a glass of beer, and Abed, after drinking and eating, he began to argue that how could the Duchess know that Wolffang would reach the final, to which Coking said that he did not know. Captain Abed, without stopping ranting that he knew that the Duchess could not be a common person and ordinary, but this was surprising in any case, and already smiling, he asked how Wolffang could still win. Coking, supporting the captain's thoughts, said that the point was not that Wolffang won, but that the great underworld thief was mistaken. It seems he stumbled when the swords clashed. Abed, thinking more about the situation, said that all this was strange, and that Wolffang, for whom the Duchess bet, won thanks to the great thief's mistake. Suddenly, a simple idea occurred to the captain, and turning to Coquin, he ordered him to find Wolffang and invite him to join them as a mercenary. At that moment, Adeline explained to her husband that with these winnings, she returned all the money she had spent on furnishing the castle, to which Ray asked her if she really did this to reimburse the money. And the Duchess, smiling, replied that to some extent, but for a comfortable life she needs her own money. Ray confidently said that the duchy has a lot of money. There are many gold coins. There are meldals, which are magical stones, and there are also all kinds of jewelry that are proof of wealth. And he hopes that Adeline does not think that the duchy has no funds. Adeline laughed cheerfully, and in turn asked the Duke if he was really bothered that she, the mistress of the house, did not know anything about his lands, and immediately added that she knew that in the lands of darkness there was a mine where meldals were stored. Large quantities, and these are very expensive magical stones and minerals that can be processed. Our heroine lowered her gaze and said quietly that it was simply the Duke's money, not hers. Our hero looked at his wife and thought that there should be no divisions between them of yours and mine, and recovering, he began to say what was between them, but he fell silent when he saw the expression on his wife's face. Adeline looked at her husband as if he had said something completely out of the ordinary, and asked him again if she had heard correctly. The Duke looked at his wife without stopping and did not hear anything she said. And then the thought crossed his mind what he was thinking now when he looked at her. But our heroine still looked inquisitively at her husband and began to ask him what he really meant. But at that moment, Wakan saw Captain Abed and, shouting, called him. Wakana waved his arms enthusiastically, shouted at Abed, and asked him to come closer to them. Captain Abed was among the crowd of people who wanted to place small bets, and with some irritation at Wakana's encouraging shouts, he turned around and walked towards the Duke. And the Duchess, approaching the Duchess, Abed ironically asked what they were doing here. Rumors reached them that they were placing bets, but he did not think that the Duke and the Duchess would be interested in this, since they had already won a lot of money. But Adeline did not pay attention to the captain's mocking tone and, in a demanding voice, asked what the situation was. Abed, realizing that he had almost gone too far, said in a calm voice that 5 orcs came out of the forest. Wacken, listening to Abed, said that orcs had not been seen for so long that he already thought they were extinct. And Adeline, thinking, began to recall that the eagle mercenaries in the past suffered great damage in this situation. Our heroine, looking at Abed and Wakan, said quietly that she had heard that 4 or 5 armed knights could hardly defeat even 1 orc. Abed confirmed the Duchess's words, and confidently, even with some excitement, added that this is how money is earned. although it is really difficult to defeat orcs. Udcocken approached our company, and turning to Captain Abid, said that it was necessary to hurry. Otherwise, other mercenaries would capture the orcs before them, to which the captain, shouting that he agreed with him and that he was already on his way, turned to the Duchess and told her that he had to leave. Adeline ran after David and, held by the Duke, said excitedly that they were going with him. Our hero, holding his wife, tried to explain to her that they would not go, as it was very dangerous, because orcs are monsters who received power from the demon queen herself. Adeline, looking at Abid and Coquin, told her husband that she knew that, but that the orcs were too strong for the mercenaries, to which Ray quietly said that no matter what happened to them, she should not worry about it. The Duchess turned to her husband with a request in her eyes, and Wackwind listened to the Duke, and did not understand how he could say such a thing. Here Wakan burst out laughing, and said between laughs that the captain only meant that it would be very dangerous there, so it was better to leave it to the mercenaries and go to a safe place. Wakan looked at our hero and said that orcs usually act alone, but now they have gathered in a group of 5 individuals, and this is very strange. The Duke thought about the information received and concluded that it means that the demon queen will wake up soon. And Wakan, hearing his captain's version, chuckled and muttered that it was a disaster and that they did not have much holy water. To pacify these monsters, Adeline, listening to her husband and his subordinate, said with alarm in her voice that if this continues, a large number of people could suffer, to which our hero said that now this city is dangerous and they need to leave. And Wakan suggested that they should then return to the hotel, but our heroine resisted and, looking her husband in the eyes, shouted that they could not leave them like this, that they needed help. But suddenly, the Duke grabbed his wife by the shoulders, and without paying attention to the Duchess trying to say something else, he repeated again and again, shouting in her face that this was impossible. Then, having calmed down a bit, in a calm voice, Ray clearly said that she should simply leave the fight with the orcs to the mercenaries. But hearing her husband and surprised by his impulse, Adeline asked him why he was stopping her. And if the fact was that the demon queen was waking up, then how would they need to know more about it? But our hero grabbed his wife tightly again, and no longer restraining himself, he shouted in her face that he was stopping her, as she could be in danger. Adeline looked at her husband's face bewildered, not understanding if he was joking now or speaking seriously. Then an idea occurred to the Duchess, and bowing her head, she said quietly that, of course, he was worried, because he could not allow the seer to suffer. But the Duke, without letting go of Adeline, shouted again, no longer restraining his emotions, that he got along well with his seer, and that she should stop constantly talking about it, since he was worried about her. Our heroine stood paralyzed in her husband's arms, and with wide eyes from surprise. She asked him if he was really worried about her. The Duke dropped his hands helplessly, and said in a hoarse voice that he did not want to see her put herself in danger. Adeline, dumbfounded, asked her husband why he was worried about her, and it was assumed that he was still worried about her because she was a seer. Our hero did not know how to confess his feelings to Adeline, how to explain all his experiences to her. The Duke looked into his wife's wide eyes and said quietly that he was worried about her because she was his wife. Adeline's head was filled with thoughts that she was really not dreaming. And it was true that the Duke really called her his wife. Standing a little to the side and watching the Duke and Duchess, laughing to himself, Wackwind thought it was a pleasant sight to watch the lovers. Wakan approached the couple and suggested that the two of them return to the hotel, and he would go to fight the orcs, since Adeline awakened the holy sword. He would kill them with one blow. Suddenly, Adeline froze, as she realized as soon as she heard what Wakan was going to do. And turning to the knight, she told him not to use the holy sword, to which Wakan asked surprisedly why not. Our heroine did not know how to answer Wakana's question, so she was in no hurry to answer, thinking that if she used the holy sword, Hela might notice it. And if Hela used her powers to find them, Adeline reasoned, then it would be revealed that she was not a seer. Adeline, after considering the answer, explained to Wakana that Ray used his powers to find her, and if she used the holy sword, the Usuras might also discover their location. Wakan confirmed that the Duchess was right, and shouting that he would return soon, he ran towards the mercenaries. Our heroine, running after the knight, wanted to stop him, excitedly shouting to Wakan to stop and go together, but the Duke abruptly grabbed her, to which Adeline exclaimed that she was really going to send Wakan alone. The Duke grabbed his wife and did not allow her to run after Wakan. Angrily, Adeline tried to tell her husband that Wacken could not use the holy sword, that he needed to be stopped, and that everyone should go together. The Duke, without letting go of the angry Adeline, replied that Wacken was strong even without the holy sword. And having calmed down, the Duchess asked him to let her go. When the Duke let go of our heroine, she lowered her head annoyed, and Ray, noticing her condition, anxiously asked her if she was offended. Our hero watched as the Duchess shook her head and asked him worriedly why she had such a sad face. Adeline mentally shouted that it was because he grabbed her too unexpectedly, and she did not expect this. Our heroine looked sadly at her husband. Then she lowered her eyes and said quietly that she was just a little surprised by the Duke's behavior. The Duchess closed her eyes and mentally told her husband that even if he killed her, she loved him so much that she could convince herself that he had a good reason for it. Our heroine began to wonder if she loved her husband, but immediately abandoned this thought. Since she loves him, she still loves him, and now she repeats his mistakes, stepping on the same rake. The Duchess mentally told her husband that if he behaved the same way as in the past, it would not be so difficult for her to cope with him now. And then, with fainter feelings, our heroine said deep in her soul, turning to her husband, who, unlike in his previous life, now treats her completely differently. Experiencing mental pain, Adeline told herself mentally that remembering the past became very painful for her.